This story began when 3 moons rose over the Red Desert. That night, Orca, the shaman of the Pareya tribe, was climbing one of the many dunes. But on the other side of the dune, a whole horde of demonic beasts awaited him. Looking at the horde of monsters below, Orca thought irritably that no matter how much you try, they are endless. However, then the shaman raised his staff and cast the spell Ether Sphere to blind the enemies with bright light. And in the next moment, Orca cast a second spell called Union. And at that very second, the dazzling light incinerated the entire demon army. However, the victory demanded a lot of strength and ki from the shaman, causing him to sigh wearily. Meanwhile, from behind approached the general of the Red Storm, Shubion, who thanked Orca for the help. But in response, the shaman stated that for strong demons, this was still not enough, which surprised Shubion, who said that if this is not enough, then Orca might be even more fearsome than his brother. The shaman shyly admitted that he had long been using a sacred artifact that maximally increases his power. Therefore, Orca does not dare to compare himself to his brother, but Shubion stated that the shaman lacks confidence and that Julian definitely could not do the same. Meanwhile, the strongest of the remaining demons began to approach the sand dune. The orc's spell only wounded them but did not kill, which worried the shaman. But Shubion smirked and encouraged his friend, reminding him that he had already greatly reduced the number of enemies, so now the orc could calmly sit down and watch. Then the general of the Red Storm shouted sternly to his warriors behind him not to make the great shaman worry and to move their asses more actively. One of the warriors caught up with Shubion and noted that among the horde of enemies there was one huge demon, but the commander declared that he would take care of that one himself. And in the next moment, Shubion commanded his squad to attack and, rushing into the attack first, promised to personally conduct training for those who killed the fewest demons. While the warriors were catching up with their commander, he had already directed his horse towards the biggest demon. But before reaching the target, Shubion jumped off the saddle and rushed towards the giant. And the giant had already swung his fist and brought it down on the general of the Red Storm. But Shubion parried the blow, striking the demon's arm with an axe. Only Shubion intended to cut off the demon's arm, but it turned out to be too strong. However, this fact did not puzzle the general at all. On the contrary, Shubion smiled because he had finally met someone on whom he could train. He had long desired to try the technique called the Great Power of Flowers. And so, without holding back, Shubion struck the demon's head with all his might using an axe. However, this blow possessed such destructive power that the weapon in the general's hands could not withstand it, and simply shattered. Following this, the struck demon collapsed into the sand, causing all the warriors of Pareya to be stunned. Meanwhile, their commander did not hold back a strong word, for his axe was forged by one of the most famous masters of the empire. But then Shubion indifferently threw aside what remained of the weapon and asked his squad, were there any killed or wounded among them? In response, the squad answered in unison that everyone was intact, upon which Shubion ordered them to collect magical crystals and retreat. But when the Red Storm squad left the battlefield, the last surviving demon appeared from the dune. He looked intently after the people and suddenly spoke in their language. Strong, become stronger. However, in the next moment, someone attacked the demon and in the blink of an eye, beheaded him. The sudden hunter turned out to be a sand fox named Derek, who was now peacefully feasting on the demon's magical crystals. Julian thought that after the unification of the desert there would be no more war, but reality was different. New monsters began to appear everywhere, and the Pareya tribe started a new war against them. However, the warriors of the tribe did not feel strong fatigue from it. For them, monsters were simply a target to be defeated, and they had no reasons for worry or despair. Thus, while the monsters were being exterminated, the Pareya tribe lived in peace. And since Pareya was a tribe founded on peace, one of the most remarkable golden ages began in its history. On that day, during a walk, Per met with Grace to report on the food supplies received from the Henhel fortress. Per thanked his daughter-in-law for her work, as the distribution of resources caused her quite a few problems, and he also heard that production had increased this year compared to the last. However, in response, the chief's wife stated that even if these rumors were true, if Per spoke to Luna like that, it could bring trouble for him. Perry admitted that he and Luna had only recently begun to reach an understanding, but he still did not like that Luna demanded the implementation of the concept of money. Then Grace warned Pear that Luna was an extraordinary person, and if one spoke with him unprepared, he would definitely dominate the interlocutor. In response, Perry said that it would not be easier for him in Grace's place, since Luna at least pretends to yield to the chief's wife. But with him, he never backs down from his point of view. Then Grace told Pear that if he was so convinced that nothing could be resolved without an argument, he should push harder, especially in the work on building the fortress. But in response, Perry admitted that he doubted this project, since they were already holding back the monsters well. However, the next moment, as if to spite his words, the ground beneath their feet trembled, signaling the opening of a new portal to the demon world. However, Grace remained calm and only told Pear that this was exactly why she supported Luna. His work on building the fortress was necessary. Meanwhile, far away in the Red Desert, a portal began to open. When it appeared for the first time, the Pariah tribe could not react properly, which almost caused a great disaster. But now everything was different. Now on the tribe's side was the power of the Mother Tree, whose roots could stop an entire horde of monsters. Its power was truly colossal. Besides the tree forming an entire forest around the oasis, most demonic beasts could not use their powers under its aura. And thanks to the tribe of elves helping the Mother Tree, the oasis was safe. At least everyone thought so. Because this time, after killing all the demons and monsters, the portal was not in a hurry to close. 2 squads were sent for reconnaissance. The first from the Orc tribe, under the command of the supreme warrior Hambaba, and the second from the Pariah tribe, under the command of Chanatu. The Orcs were the first to dare to enter the portal, but Chanatu's squad was not far behind them. However, after passing through the strange portal, the warriors of the 2 tribes found themselves in a place never seen before, and they were separated. The Chanatu squad found themselves on a huge slab levitating in the middle of a gray void. The Kambaba squad was not visible nearby, but now Chanatu and his people were more worried about the flock of winged demons that descended on them from above. Warriors of the Pariah tribe, who have closed hundreds of portals in over 10 years, and the 5th generation of the Red Storm, who have just recently begun fighting in the war, engaged in a fierce battle with the demons. However, the battlefield was limited, and the demons simply began to push the warriors off the slab. One of them faced death in the monster's claws, but fortunately Chanat came to the rescue in time. However, victory was still very far away. The enemy outnumbered them and kept advancing, and it was at that moment that Chanat noticed Kambabu. The supreme warrior of the Orc tribe called upon chaos, intending to close the portal from within, and his spell worked. The exit from the dimension opened and all the wars rushed towards him. But on the other side of the portal, they were all awaited not by the Red Desert, but by the shore of the Shadow Sea. Neither the Kanat nor Kambab had ever seen anything like it before, but most importantly, they both had no idea where they were at all. Meanwhile, in the Pariah tribe, a meeting of the Supreme Desert Council took place. Karedos, the second wife of the chief, spoke out against the construction of the fortress, considering this project too costly for the tribe. The supreme warrior, Luna, would have liked to agree with her, but he could not refuse the construction. Karedos perfectly understood that the construction of the fortress would benefit the tribe, but in the future and in the current situation, it was reckless. But Luna did not agree with the chief's wife. He believed that it was precisely because of the current situation that the tribe could not concentrate all its forces on construction. Then Pear intervened in the dispute and tried to explain that it was not about abandoning construction altogether, but about doing it gradually. But Luna was adamant and declared that there could be no retreats or delays. This is the path of a hero, so the construction must be completed. However, everyone in the council understood that this would not be just a construction, but a grand flight across 2 closed regions, the eastern and western deserts. Then Pear admitted that the construction of the fortress was necessary, but many in the tribe were currently under great pressure. But Luna assured that these factors were taken into account in the current plan, which was developed for the well-being of all the desert tribes, so it could not be postponed. And then he reminded everyone present that this was a matter of the future of their desert, and for this their deity sacrifices himself. Against such an argument, neither Keredos nor Pere had anything more to say. However, the next moment Shubeon entered the tent and from the threshold declared that he agreed with Luna's opinion. But then he informed the Supreme Council of the Desert that the demons are beginning to organize. Pere asked what that meant, and then Shubeon explained that the demons are starting to think like humans. Moreover, they are beginning to acquire more definite forms. The new types of demons now look the same and differ only in size. But then Keredos asked, "Isn't that more convenient, since instead of studying many different demons, they would only need to study a few new ones? That would indeed be good." But Shubeon explained that in reality, demons have different characteristics. It's like if a giant scorpion moved and attacked like a sand dragon. Because of this, knowledge about the old demons became practically useless. New research is necessary, and until then the warriors have no choice but to risk themselves. That is why Shubeon agreed with Luna. The tribe simply needs walls. Meanwhile, while the Supreme Council meeting was taking place in the Red Desert, the story moves to the Henkel Fortress, Empire of Silence. For 10 years now, Haisha Sanakin has lived here, one of the former commanders of the Red Storm Squad, and now the Emperor's son-in-law. Life behind the fortress walls weakened Haisha, so he tried to regain strength with daily training. However, this morning, Asha, Haisha's son, decided to visit his father during training. Syra, Haisha's wife and at the same time princess of the Silence Empire, asked her husband to rest properly at home, but he assured her that training was rest for him. Meanwhile, Asha asked his father, when will they go to the desert? In response, Haisha explained with a smile that when Asha turns 10, he will have to live in the desert and undergo warrior training. However, then the boy suddenly remembered and asked, "Where is Uncle Slint?" Haisha himself wondered about this question, but Sarah explained that Slint had gone to the Devil's Field. Then Haisha reasonably asked why, to which Saira told how Asha saw a mercenary squad and liked the armor of one of them, so Slint went to find materials for the same kind. However, then the princess became sad because despite numerous requests from the Pariah tribe, the Silence Empire remains silent, which makes her feel awkward in front of her husband. But Haisha calmed his wife, reminding her that only thanks to her the portal is safe. Syra thanked her husband for his words and told Asha that his father needs to rest. Haisha did not mind playing with his son a little longer, but the boy said that Khatun's brother also misses their father, but is holding on, so he will hold on too. At this, Haisha said goodbye to his family, and when they left, he thought that it was time to marry off Slint. Meanwhile, in the main castle of the Kingdom of Rossini, a meeting of lords and nobles was also taking place. Duke Wilhelm proposed sending a delegation with a punitive squad to the border of the Red Desert. But Duke Albrecht objected since the Kingdom of Rossini and the Kingdom of Pariah had no connections so far, and who were they to tell them what to do? Then Wilhelm reminded that the Kingdom of Pariah was only a developing state, but Albrecht was not behind, and also reminded that above all, Pariah was an ally of the treacherous Silence Empire. Wilhelm did not deny that perhaps Pariah was looking for a reason to unite with the Silence Empire and invade them, to which the king himself asked, "What then does the Duke propose to do?" In response, Wilhelm suggested sending a punitive squad to the border to partially satisfy Pariah's demands, but Albrecht again protested, as this was tantamount to submission. A dispute broke out again between the dukes, and then the king turned to the wisest woman and asked, "What does she think?" In response, the woman who hid her face behind a mask agreed that the Kingdom of Pariah would not be a weak opponent. However, if even Shaoni so easily gave up the Henkel fortress, then Pariah had a strength that the Kingdom of Rossini could not appreciate. Then Duke Biffet reminded that Pariah was just a tribe of desert savages, to which the wisest woman advised not to underestimate the enemy so thoughtlessly. The Duke wanted to object, but the wisest woman stated that she had met the king of the Pariah tribe, and she also added that he was an unusual man, and only in his gaze was felt greatness and strength. Then the king clarified, "Should a squad be sent in that case?" In response, the wisest woman advised to observe how the Silence Empire would react, but it would be good to send part of the troops to the border to deal with the local monsters. But then the king revealed that there were opinions among the nobility that it would be difficult to manage these troops due to the activity of the Silence Empire. In response, the wisest declared that even if the empire really begins an invasion, the flame must be extinguished. However, the king disagreed, as spies reported that the empire was using them as a pretext to avoid fulfilling Parea's demands, and therefore it might be better not to rush into action and not extinguish the flame. A little later, the wisest, whose name was Ariel, secretly met with Duke Urfe to discuss the past assembly. Duke Urfe was slightly displeased with the wisest's actions, as the increased confusion in the council would benefit their organization. And Urfe also reminded that their ultimate goal was to establish order in the world, but for the sake of the common good, some sacrifices are inevitable. Ariel understood the Duke's concern, but now the sacrifices were excessive, and besides, the decision was hers. Urfe was not going to deny this. And then Ariel declared that she had made the final decision. Their organization would minimize unnecessary bloodshed because the wisest did not want to allow the destruction of the world. Meanwhile, inside the portal, Julian, the chief of the Parea tribe, was fighting demons. Having killed the last monster, Julian wondered, why are there fewer and fewer of them? Something had changed, but the chief decided not to perceive it positively or as another disaster. Be that as it may, this change was now to Julian's advantage. However, returning from the portal, the chieftain discovered that an unexpected guest was waiting for him in the fortress. It was Vincent, a member of the royal guard of the kingdom of Rosini and an old acquaintance of Julian. There was no truth in the saying, "at one's feet," and after the battle it wouldn't hurt to have some refreshment, so the chieftain gladly invited his friend to the table. During the meal, Vincent jokingly noted that for a desert chieftain, Julian's food was rather meager, but the alcohol was excellent. In response, the chieftain only smiled and said that everything in the stomach would mix anyway, and he would toast with Vincent to their meeting. However, then Julian grew sad and admitted that coming here, he finally understood Vincent's words that no one has the right to stand between him and Roof. Now the chieftain understood the great sacrifice his friend had made. At first, Vincent was struck by Julian's revelation, then with a smile said that it was a great honor for him to hear such words from the desert chieftain. But Julian continued and declared that if it were not for Vincent, the desert would not be as it is now, and all the tribes would be occupied fighting countless demons. Then in response, Vincent assured that this would not have happened because the desert is strong. Nevertheless, Julian bowed his head and thanked his friend on behalf of all the desert inhabitants. In this fortress, Julian has been for 10 years already, so he thought a lot, and above all, the leader thought about how Vincent managed to endure. Then Vincent asked if Julian regretted it, since he had not seen how much the desert had developed over these years. In response, the leader stated that of course he regretted it, but it was not regret that brought him here, but overconfidence, since Julian believed that only he could handle this. At the leader's words, Vincent admitted with annoyance that it would be good if all the idiots from the kingdom of Rosini were at least half as much like Julian. Then Vincent said that the knowledgeable remain silent, and the ignorant speak and act as if they understand something, because the knowledgeable are afraid and cannot even open their mouths. Julian admitted that this was a difficult case, and Vincent added that nothing could be done about it, and now they needed at least to stop the spread of monsters. This is one of the reasons why Vincent came to the leader, and also he thinks that lately the demons have become extremely aggressive. Julian was reported about this, as well as about the fact that requests for reinforcements across the continent are being declined. Hearing this news, Vincent apologized to the leader on behalf of the kingdom of Rosini. Julian was ready to accept apologies from all the people on the continent, but not from a friend, so he asked Vincent not to worry about it. Then Vincent asked the leader, does he have any thoughts on this matter? Meanwhile, Heish had an important meeting with members of the embassy of the Silence Empire. One of the advisors regretfully reported that the empire would not be able to help the Parea tribe, as it was still recovering from the consequences of the civil war and the ongoing conflict with the kingdom of Rosini. But then the ambassador sweetened the pill and assured that the promised supplies would be provided no matter what. Haisha silently listened to the advisors before him, and in his thoughts wondered how these people gave away what rightfully belonged to the tribe, as if doing them a favor. Nevertheless, he accepted the handout with a smile and hinted that apparently the empire's situation was indeed extremely difficult. Then Haisha recalled that the Pareya tribe also needed to ask the Empire for something. The fact was that it had become difficult to obtain magical crystals now. Lately, they had become increasingly rare to drop from defeated demons, so Pareya was forced to reduce supplies. The ambassador guessed that this was a threat and tried to remind about the agreement concluded between the most serene emperor and the wise chieftain. But Haisha listened to him half-heartedly and thought only about how he wanted to return to the tribe. Meanwhile, the ambassador asked, shouldn't the promised exchange of goods be fulfilled in such relations? In response, Haisha agreed. But the tribe had no reliable way to solve the labor shortage problem. Therefore, he proposed the following. Pareya would allow the Empire to place a garrison on the outskirts of the Henkel Plain to give it the opportunity to control the number of demons and obtain crystals from them. This means that the garrison would have to support itself independently, which made the ambassador think, wouldn't it be better then to send these forces into the desert for quality crystals? Moreover, on Haisha's face it was literally written, if you need this, take it by your own means. Do not try to use others. And in conclusion, Haisha mentioned that the kingdom of Rossini requested a trade cooperation agreement, which immediately upset the ambassador. But Haisha calmed him down, assuring that he refused the proposal. However, circumstances have arisen that make it impossible to continue complying with the agreement with the Silence Empire, and therefore Pareya feels the need to make changes to it. The ambassador tried to explain that he dared not interfere in such matters, but Haisha stated that this is exactly why he is talking about it in advance, to give the empire time to discuss everything. In that case, the ambassador assured that he would report this to the emperor, and he himself wondered, what has Princess Sarah been doing all this time? She did not inform the ambassador about such an important situation, so he asked Haisha for the opportunity to visit the princess. Haisha did not refuse the request, and soon the ambassador met with Saira in her office. But left alone with the princess, the ambassador immediately asked, does Saira really not understand how precarious the situation of their homeland is? But in response, the princess stated that the homeland does not understand at all how difficult her situation is. And at the same time, the empire is not at all concerned about the position of the imperial son-in-law. The ambassador suggested that something was wrong between the princess and Haisha, but Saira asked sternly, what has the homeland done for her and her husband in the last 3 years? If the empire so wanted Saira to help the homeland, it should have created conditions for Haisha to use his powers. The ambassador had no response to such an argument. Therefore, Saira continued and told how her husband fulfilled the empire's unreasonable demands and demanded nothing in return. For 3 years, Haisha did nothing but yield and care for others. Because of this, in Pareya, they discussed whether to leave Haisha in Henkel, and at the same time discussed the possibility of replacing him with the supreme warrior Luna. At such news, the ambassador exclaimed that this was impossible, because this Luna would bring no benefit to the empire. Saira agreed with the ambassador on this, and hinted to him that in diplomacy, if you take something, you must give something in return. The ambassador tried to explain to the princess that it still wouldn't work, but Saira demanded that he give what he could give, at least something that would help Haisha save face in Pareya. The next morning, Slint returned to the Henkel fortress, and not empty-handed. For Ashi, he brought the skin of a black tiger, which would later become part of his warrior armor. Haisha was sincerely surprised by such a catch, as he thought that black tigers no longer lived in the Devil's Field, but Slint assured him that there were still many there. At such news, Haisha became wary, because even if monsters reproduce quickly, they could not have restored their numbers so soon. Meanwhile, Slint inquired when Hiruna and Katuna would return, to which Haisha replied that only next year. Then Slint lamented that they had been gone for too long, to which Haisha asked, if he was so worried, why didn't he go with them? In response, Slint stated that he was not worried, just bored, and besides, Hiruna and Katuna were now strong enough to take care of themselves. But Haisha was skeptical of his friend's words and said that Hiruna and Katuna were still young and not that strong. However, Slint assured that it would take 4 or 5 warriors to deal with them. Meanwhile, Hiruna and Katuna were undergoing training at the Inama Empire Academy. Only upon arriving here did young Katuna realize that the empire lacked much. But the budget was always primarily invested in the academy, even more than anywhere else. And yet, during his training, Katuna began to doubt. Would the Pareya tribe be able to catch up with the Inama Empire despite this? The young man's thoughts were interrupted by one of his classmates who asked, "Does he have plans for today?" The thing was, the girl was having a party at her house in the evening, so she thought it would be great if Katuna came to it. But he refused without hesitation, as he had private lessons in the evening. Then the girl tried to persuade Katuna, saying that sometimes one needs to take a day off, and the third prince himself promised to attend the party. In response, Katuna thanked her for the invitation, but said this was valuable training time, so he did not want to be distracted. The girl was predictably upset by such an answer, and her friends told Katuna that not everyone could get into that party. When the trio of girls left, Katuna looked after them and thought that they were so used to what they had, but did not even realize how valuable it was, because there was so little time for studying. And he also thought that he should have gone to study in the Silence Empire, because the cultures of the East and West are different, and therefore he could surely learn something new there. Lost in thought, Katuna gazed thoughtfully out the window, which overlooked the academy courtyard. However, what he saw there made the young man suddenly jump up from his desk and run out of the classroom. The reason for such behavior was that at that very moment some student with his friends was bothering his sister, Hiruna. Hiruna was invited to that same party, but the girl politely refused, as she had many things to do today. Only the heir of the Grimm family had his own opinion. He thought that the wild girl was just acting as if she was better than him. Therefore, he boldly grabbed Hiruna by the hand and declared that she would go with them. However, to the rudeness's surprise, Hiruna skillfully slipped out of his hand and tripped him. The young man immediately fell to his knees, and his friends mockingly asked if his legs couldn't hold him because of nervousness. From such humiliation, Grimm flew into a rage and called Hiruna a dirty wild girl. But the girl calmly warned that if Grimm cannot stand on his feet on such a clear day, then what will happen to him at night? For Grimm, this was the last straw, and having lost all remaining honor, he raised his hand against Hiruna. However, she easily dodged the blow and asked the scoundrel, "Who is the savage?" after that. And as a bonus to her words, Hiruna again tripped Grimm, causing him to fall flat on the floor. And when Grimm got up with a broken nose, he declared that he had only pitied the savage girl and magnanimously wanted to help her. But then, Hiruna pretended to be concerned, wondering how Grimm would be able to do his job in the future if he cannot stand on his feet and has poor vision. Grimm intended to attack the girl again, but at that very moment Katuna approached her. Grimm did not know that this was Hiruna's brother, so he assumed that he was her boyfriend. However, when asked where he came from, Katuna did not answer and silently turned away. Then Hiruna smiled, took her brother by the arm, and together they headed back to the building. But the humiliated Grimm could not let it go and furiously rushed after them. He intended to strike Katuna from behind, but without turning around, Katuna kicked Grimm in the jaw with his heel. And when he was on the ground again, Katuna declared that Grimm was a shameless man and a disgrace to his family. Then in response, Grimm swore by the name of his family that he would take revenge on both of them. However, in the next moment, Katuna knelt and Hiruna bowed respectfully. And then someone behind Grimm asked, "What is the name of his famous lineage?" And when Grimm turned around, he saw that the question was asked by His Majesty the Emperor himself. Grimm immediately fell prostrate before him and, trembling with fear, introduced himself. But Katuna and Hiruna calmly greeted His Majesty as if he were an old friend. The Emperor was embarrassed and asked to be called by his first name, but Hiruna insisted, since he is the supreme ruler of the empire. Then the Emperor admitted that he wished he had a daughter like Hiruna, to which the girl reminded him that the princes would be very upset if they heard those words. In response, the Emperor remained silent, but in his thoughts reasoned. Since he does not have such a daughter, there is a way to keep Hiruna close. Then he honored Grimm with his attention and declared that he would later figure out what happened here. But for now, the young man could leave. And when Grimm departed, the Emperor invited Hiruna and Katuna to dinner, to which the girl agreed with a smile. Then the emperor said to the silent Khatun that one cannot always be poring over books and that he still needs to learn what secular life is. In response, Khatun bowed his head and thanked for the invitation, to which the emperor promised that he would send a carriage for them in the evening. At that, the emperor said goodbye to the children of the desert leader and headed to the palace, listening to the report of his secretary, Meroto, along the way. He reported that Grimm's father is one of the ministers of foreign affairs, but his son, it seems, did not inherit even the few virtues that his father has. However, in response, the emperor calmly stated that ears that do not hear are not needed by the empire, and even less so a tongue that speaks insults. Meroto was horrified by such an order and tried to dissuade his lord, but from just one look from the emperor, the secretary immediately bowed and assured that he would carry out the order. Then finally the emperor added that such insignificance as Grimm only disgrace him instead of trying to win favor. Meanwhile, in the castle of the kingdom of Rosini, another meeting took place, but this time Vincent was present. He dispassionately reported to the council that he had delivered the information to Julian, and also reminded all present that the Perea tribe had sacrificed much for the kingdom of Rosini. Then in response, Duke Urfe also reminded that first and foremost, Vincent is a member of the royal guard, acting on behalf of the entire kingdom. But Vincent calmly stated that the Duke was mistaken, as he only serves the kingdom, not the man of the king. And since he was mentioned, Vincent decided to inquire of His Highness, what does he think? But the king answered the question with a question. Why is Vincent so angry? Then Vincent wearily explained that he had already said about 10 times today that a squad needed to be sent to the Red Desert because the monster activity was unusual. And again, Duke Urfe objected, reminding that he had already explained 10 times that the kingdom currently had no opportunity to send a large squad because the Silence Empire was constantly watching them. However, Vincent had a different opinion. According to rumors, the Silence Empire says that it is the Rosini kingdom that constantly watches them, so the empire cannot send troops to the desert. This whole situation reminded Vincent of 2 sworn enemies stuck in the same boat trying to survive a storm. But then Sir Isaac von Devian, nicknamed the Sword of the Rossini Kingdom, entered the council hall. He respectfully greeted His Highness, to which the king asked, why has he not pleased him with a visit to the palace for so long? Isaac apologized for such a long absence, but recently he had a small revelation and could not leave the castle until he figured it out. Then the king congratulated him on completing his training, but Isaac declared that this was only the beginning and that is why he wanted to ask His Majesty for something. In response, the king assured that he would always support him and would spare nothing for this. Then Isaac declared that he wanted to go to the Red Desert. At these words, the king's face stretched out in amazement, but Vincent took Isaac's desire with great interest. In the evening of the same day, as agreed, Khatuna and Hiruna came to the emperor for dinner. He apologized for today's incident, but Hiruna asked the emperor not to worry about it, since she and her brother already had enough from him caring so much about them. Then the emperor asked Hiruna if she liked it here, to which the girl admitted that there was much in the empire to learn. Khatuna supported his sister and added that there was so much interesting in the empire that it seemed there would not be enough time for everything. The emperor suggested that his dinner was taking precious time from the young man, but Khatuna assured that this was not so, and he was immensely grateful for the granted chance to study abroad. Then the emperor smiled and admitted that it would be good if Chanatu also came here, as it would be more beneficial for him to get an education in the Inama Empire. However, Hiruna perfectly understood that everyone in the empire considered her and her brother hostages. Therefore, Hiruna calmly explained that since she and Khatuna were studying the culture of the Western continent, it would be better for Chanatu to study the culture of the East. And the girl also added that she and Khatuna were in no way inferior to Chanatu in value and also claimed to become young leaders. In response, the emperor laughed and assured that for him, Hiruna and Khatuna were like dear nephews. Then Hiruna hinted that in that case, Chanatu was also like a nephew to His Majesty. The emperor smiled pleasantly and thought that if Hiruna were a boy, she would already be undergoing training for the next generation of leaders. Aloud, the emperor admitted that he sincerely regretted that Hiruna was not blood of his blood, because then he would have nothing to worry about at all. Then in response, Hiruna said that it would be the greatest happiness for her, but now she liked her homeland more, and probably it would be so in the future as well. The emperor understood the girl's hint. He might not try to connect her with his sons, and that meant he had to come up with another way before Hiruna and Katuna returned home, even if it meant resorting to somewhat harsh methods. Meanwhile, Frail, the ruler of the Meteran Plains, was inspecting his domains. With his keen gaze, he spotted a trespasser in the forest and loudly called Harun. Harun was a male white gorilla, who immediately rushed toward the trespasser of the plains borders. The trespasser turned out to be a demon, but as soon as Harun approached, it vanished in the blink of an eye. And the next moment, Frail arrived to Harun, warning his friend of the danger. And just in time, because at that very second the same demon attacked from above, but Harun managed to jump back. Then the demon targeted Fryla, but the ruler of the plains deftly dodged the monster's tentacles, and with one blow knocked its head off. However, Fryla was wary of such an easy victory, since demons had previously been elusive. In any case, this was the last intruder, so now he and Harun could breathe a sigh of relief. And at that time, 3 moons had already risen over the Red Desert. But that night they had a keen observer. That night, secluded in the mountains, Noah was watching the night sky. When he was known as Chongmen Hun, the high priest of the Church of the Enlightened, but now he was merely a hermit named Noah. Gazing at the stars, he wondered, how great were his sins that the gods did not send him to hell, but continued to torment him so. But then Noah sensed someone's presence and ordered the stranger to show himself. At that very second, a portal opened behind him, from which emerged the high priestess of the Church of the Enlightened, named Mirik. She greeted the old friend and asked how long it had been since they last met, to which Noah replied, 10 years. But then he admitted that he did not understand what to do, since both of them could not die, to which Mirik said that the will of the Creator is impossible to comprehend. Then, in response, Noah declared that his God is cruel, but the local God is no less cruel, and therefore Noah wonders, when will his time come? Mirik agreed with the words of the old friend. She had lived more than 100 years, studying that time and preparing for it, but still had not found an answer. However, then the priestess bitterly reported that a change of species had occurred, which made Noah shudder. It started because of the evolution of demonic beings, which means now they will become more ferocious and everything will depend on the decisions of the chosen ones. Then Noah informed the priestess that recently one of the 3 seals had been broken, and perhaps that is why the change of species occurred. Now Mirik understood why so many portals began to appear, but Noah noted that in the 2 remaining places, the seals had become stronger. Then he lamented that the children who made a choice began to fight each other to change each other's choice, but Mirik called it a natural process, but Noah considered it arrogance. He always thought that humanity's striving for survival was natural, but now people are biting each other even when disasters are everywhere. However, in response, Mirik said that they, the priests, are simply doing everything possible because no one knows when the time will come. Then the priestess asked what Noah now intended to do, to which he replied that now he would have a lot of troubles. Only 2 unfinished seals remain. Because of this, the space will narrow, and as it narrows, there will be more clashes between chaos and order. And Noah also wished for everything to end in this generation, because it would be too cruel if it dragged on to the next. Miriam could only hope that it would be so. After all, they had both waited too long for this. Then Noah looked again at the night sky and declared that everything must end in this generation. The next day, another portal in the Red Desert was completely cleared of demons by Julian. However, when the chieftain was about to leave the portal, his body was possessed by the heavenly demon. The dark entity inside Julian warned that this was his last chance and offered to unite so that the whole world would fall at their feet. In response, the chieftain smiled ominously and declared that the world would indeed lie at his feet. And in the next moment, he expelled the heavenly demon and added that he did not intend to achieve this goal with him. But before completely disappearing, the heavenly demon said one last thing. Sooner or later, Julian himself would come to him for help, and he eagerly awaited that day. That was the end, and the chieftain wearily headed for the exit. And having gotten outside, Julian reunited with his faithful horse nicknamed Fierce Fang. On the way home, the chieftain wondered, why had the world around become darker than 10 years ago? However, his further thoughts were interrupted by an ambush of demons. Right in front of Julian, clusters of dark energy appeared, threatening to turn into a new portal. But before the leader could do anything, a beam of light struck the clusters of dark energy, which, like a snake, began to destroy them one by one. At that very moment, Julian felt a great power, and then his eyes widened at what he saw. Because the beam of light turned out to be a sand fox named Deity. Only after completely dealing with the dark clusters did the fox pay attention to the desert leader. Then Julian asked his old friend, does he recognize him? However, in response, Deity growled threateningly at the leader. But Julian was not upset because he remembered Lacri's words. She warned that Deity would follow Julian until he became a sacred animal, but after that, he would only perform his role. However, since Deity did not attack immediately, it means he still remembers something. So Julian dismounted. In response, the sand fox stopped growling and cautiously approached the leader. However, then Deity's attention was caught by Fierce Fang, causing the horse to become nervous. But Julian calmed him down and reminded him that Deity used to play with Fierce Fang often. The fox tilted his head to the side, as if pondering the leader's words, and the next moment he nimbly jumped onto Fierce Fang's head, as he used to do before. Julian was glad that Deity still remembered something and offered the fox a green magical crystal, which he liked before. However, in response, Deity threw the crystal away with his paw, indicating that he no longer feeds on such things. Then the fox boldly jumped onto Julian's shoulder and began to sniff his old wound on the neck with interest. The leader reassured his friend, saying it was just a scratch, but Deity licked the old scar on the neck, and it immediately disappeared. After that, Deity simply jumped down from Julian's shoulder and ran away. The leader understood that he also had his own mission, so he said goodbye, saying that if it was meant to be, they would meet again someday. And later, that same day, Julian finally reached the fortress that his tribe was building. As soon as the leader approached it, the workers, every single one, froze upon recognizing the traveler as Julian Provoca. They all immediately shouted in unison about the leader's return, and soon a breathless Luna ran up to Julian. He could not believe his eyes, and therefore asked the chief in amazement, "Is it really him?" And when Julian called him by name, Luna properly greeted his chief after 10 long years of separation. However, the reunion did not last long. Over 10 years, Julian had accumulated more than 1 stack of documents, which Luna could not sort out alone. Therefore, he immediately set the desert chief behind a desk, not even letting him rest from the journey or at least wash up. And now, diligently signing one document after another, Julian understood why Luna had waited for his return more than anyone else. As soon as he dealt with one mountain of documents, Luna immediately brought another. After 6 hours of continuous writing, Julian finally could not stand it and asked, "How much longer will this continue?" But in response, Luna reassured the chief, assuring that only a few days of hard work remained, and then he would definitely manage everything. At the prospect, Julian immediately remembered that he had urgent business, but Luna strictly ordered him to stay put. The next day, Pear visited the future fortress. However, the result did not impress him, which made the deputy chief skeptically state that, for now, this is unrealistic. His words reached Luna, who asked, "Why is Pear still negative?" In response, he admitted that he understood the necessity of building a fortress, but he would like everything to happen more calmly and measuredly. Then Luna hinted that neighboring countries, which pay nothing, should also participate in the construction, to which Pear asked, "Hasn't the tribe already requested reinforcements?" But in response, Luna stated that one should not ask for help, but demand it, since it is thanks to the tribe's sacrifices that other countries now live in peace, unaware of troubles. Then Pear reminded that portals exist not only in the Red Desert, and it is also said that chaos now reigns across the entire continent. But Luna was adamant and declared that those are their problems, and the tribe has enough of its own. Moreover, there are still fewer portals in neighboring countries than in the desert, so they must repay the tribe. But then Pear asked, "Hasn't the tribe already received considerable support?" To which Luna explained that this is not support, but deserved payment. And then he added that desert affairs should be decided by desert people, with which Pear could not disagree. However, before the argument could continue, Julian approached Pear and Luna, asking about the topic of their serious conversation. Pear evaded the answer, praising the chief's new outfit, to which Julian admitted that after Grace dragged him into the tent, he woke up already in that state. Then the chief looked at the fortress and stated that opinions may differ, but there should be no division in the tribe. Then in response, Luna assured that this is not a division, just that he and Pear have different views on the pace of achieving the goal. Pear supported Luna, acknowledging that there was a considerable amount of sense in his opinion, and if the tribe had taken on building a fortress, it was better to finish it as soon as possible. Julian smiled quite pleasantly and promised that he would think about how to speed up the construction. Then Pear warned that he needed to prepare for the qualifying test for the Red Storm squad, and with that, he took his leave. As for Luna, he still had things to discuss with the chief, but he suggested discussing everything over lunch. Julian agreed, and soon the chief and Luna secluded themselves on a dune away from the construction site. Chewing a cookie, Julian noted that in all the documents he had reviewed, there was nothing that required his personal attention. In response, Luna explained that the chief had to check everything personally because only after that could he make truly important decisions. From the documents, Julian learned that the tribe lacked materials and people, but the main problem was the increasing burden on the warriors. Luna revealed that the reason for this was the portals. Previously, the tribe effectively controlled them, but now that was in the past. Now the frequency of portal appearances had increased, and accordingly, the number of demons had also increased, including high-level ones. Then Julian asked about the action plan developed for such a case, to which Luna explained that the plan was not so smooth and had many shortcomings. Then Julian asked what options there were, and Luna replied that there were only two options. The first of them is to push the monsters to the outskirts. For this, a fortress is being built, but among the tribesmen, this idea has many opponents. But the main problem is that the monsters are changing. They have developed intelligence and have started to retreat if they feel they are at a disadvantage. Julian also noticed this. The monsters have become more like humans, and their movements are becoming increasingly cunning. Then Luna continued and said that this is exactly why many monsters are already crossing the border and he cannot predict where they will move next. Julian decided to continue the further discussion on the way to Pear, who was already conducting qualifying tests for the recruits. Luna mentioned that the Silence and Inama empires could become a problem, to which Julian asked, "Is it true that he ignores all their requests for help?" Luna confirmed the rumors, to which the chief stated that he acted correctly because empires must defend themselves. Such an answer slightly surprised Luna, as Julian always said that people should always be the priority. But he explained that their people are the highest priority, and they are not obliged to shed their blood for others. In the 10 years that Julian spent in the desert, he thought a lot about this, and realized that people remain indifferent until trouble touches them personally. But then the chief recalled the second option, to which Luna admitted that he plans to build a wall to create a space where monsters can be confined. Then Julian suggested that Luna wants to expand this space and turn the wall itself into a weapon. Luna confirmed the chief's suspicion and added that if they manage to complete the wall, it will become the most powerful weapon in the entire desert, and the countries that ignored their requests will pay the price. Julian realized that Luna was going to pressure the neighboring countries to provide them with supplies, and in return, the tribe would take on the extermination of demons. The chief liked this plan very much, but Luna warned that it would inevitably cause diplomatic tensions. However, Julian calmly asked what they could possibly do to them, and added that if the neighboring countries were to shed blood alongside them, then there would be no problems. Finally, Julian told Luna to act as he saw fit, and when the chief left, Luna thought that Julian had really changed a lot, which meant there was nothing left to lose and soon the whole world would be forced to submit to the will of their tribe. Meanwhile, the selection of the 5th batch of candidates for the Red Storm squad began. Originally, it was created in Perea as one of the elite squads, but now Red Storm has the reputation of being the most respected unit in the entire desert. Therefore, Volunteers wishing to join its ranks came from all tribes. However, to do this, one had to prove that they were a recognized desert warrior, so the competition was fiercer than ever. Looking at the gathered candidates, Julian thought about how much had changed in 10 years. Since when the squad was just being formed, it barely gathered the required number of warriors. Meanwhile, Shubion, standing nearby, complained that Haisha should be standing in his place now, to which Julian smirked and suggested swapping places with him. Shubion appreciated the leader's concern, but preferred to endure the headache here, and he also did not want to unleash a war with the Silence Empire in a fit of anger. Instead, Shubion suggested appointing him to the vanguard of the assault squad, because as a general he was overwhelmed with work. But in response, Julian irritably explained that to get here, he had to sign so many documents that his hands were already falling off. Shubion understood the hint and did not dare to complain further. Then Julian offered his help in conducting the selection. Shubion did not refuse it, and explained to the leader that most of the candidates undergoing the tests were warriors of the third and later waves. For them, to show off their skills before the leader himself was a huge chance, however. Great anxiety was visible on their faces. Meanwhile, one of the judges announced that today the leader himself decided to join the selection process, and therefore those who wished to be tested personally by him would have to line up in front of Julian. However, as soon as the judge fell silent, all the candidates immediately gathered before the leader. The judge was about to divide them into groups, but Julian stopped him. Then he ordered all participants to form a column of 5 people each. Then the leader explained the essence of the selection. The candidates must imagine that an enemy is in front of them and deliver 1 chopping strike and then 1 stabbing strike. The participants were surprised by the simplicity of the conditions, and also wondered how the leader would be able to keep track of all of them. Nevertheless, when Julian commanded, everyone without exception executed the swing and lunge as one. Then the leader approached one of the warriors and ordered him to leave the formation. After that, Julian began to walk along the rows and choose those who had to leave the formation. And those participants chosen by the leader began to wonder, had they passed the test or been eliminated? But soon, Julian answered their questions, stating that those who remained in the formation could try their luck next time or earn recognition by performing a feat. However, among the eliminated participants, there was one young warrior who refused to believe in defeat. His name was Manhwa, and he was sure that the leader clearly had not examined him properly. Therefore, he dared to address Julian and ask the reason. One of the judges immediately reprimanded the audacious youth, but the leader asked Manhwa to come forward and introduce himself. He did as he was told and introduced himself as the son of Alikal. Julian inquired where Alikal himself was when his son was undergoing the test. But Shubion answered for the youth, explaining that all the warriors of the first and second waves were busy. Then the leader told Manhwa that his strike was very strong, but the youth did not understand why he had not passed. In response, Julian asked Manhwa to strike once more, and he immediately repeated the swing. Manhwa put all his strength into this strike, and in his thoughts he thought, now the chief will definitely notice his skill. However, in the next moment, Julian literally knocked the ground out from under his feet by tripping him. And when Manhwa fell into the sand, the chief explained that he had excellently shown the power of his strike, but it was the power of only the upper part of the body. The fact that Manhwa grew up watching his father could have been poison for him, and if the youth's legs were trained, he would not have lost his balance. But these were only words. Julian believed that it was better to show once than to hear 100 times. Therefore, he himself decided to demonstrate the power of a true shamshir. After such a spectacle, no one had any more questions, and Manhwa was forced to admit that he had mistakenly believed he had already caught up with his father. However, Julian strictly ordered him to raise his head, because if a warrior realizes his shortcomings, isn't that a reason for joy? And then in response, Manhwa straightened up and shouted loudly, "Yes!" Such an answer satisfied the chief, and finally he said that training the legs is the foundation of foundations, and if Manhwa succeeds in this, he will be able to continue his father's work with dignity. At this point, Julian left the young warrior and continued the selection. Meanwhile, Shubion approached Manhwa and suddenly asked him for forgiveness. The youth was stunned by such a turn, and then Shubion explained that the first teacher of every warrior is his father, so it was he who let Manhwa down. After all, it was precisely because of Shubion that Alikal had so little time to care for his son. He was so busy with the affairs of the Red Storm that he couldn't even attend Manka's exam. Therefore, Shubayan told the youth to come to him when he was ready, and then the general of the Red Storm himself would personally conduct the trial and accept him. In response, Manka thanked the mentor and assured him that now he knew his flaws, so he would try to come here again as soon as possible. And Julian, watching them, smiled thoughtfully. When did Shubayan learn to speak like a true leader? Meanwhile, the Red Storm squad under the command of Chanatu dealt with another horde of demons. However, while cutting up their carcasses, the warriors noticed that magical crystals became less frequent for them to find. This was a big problem for the warriors, as all of them were married, and some even had several wives to support. However, there was still one avid bachelor in the Red Storm squad. And so in passing, the warriors decided to ask their commander, why was he still unmarried? There was even a rumor in the squad that Chanatu had health problems, but he angrily stated that he was fine. However, since the commander had no problems in the male department, the warriors assumed that someone was already waiting for him. Chanatu did not continue this topic, and as punishment ordered the squad to check another location for demons. But before that, he declared once again that he was ashamed that last time the Red Storm did less than the Orc tribe warriors. If it weren't for Humbaba, they wouldn't be here now. The warriors understood this and shared their commander's shame. And they were also tired of the constant mockery from the senior warriors of the first and second waves. One of the warriors even dared to say that compared to the Orc tribe, the senior warriors were not so different from them. However, in response, Chanatu told his squad that they had no idea what they were talking about, because the first and second generations of warriors were trained by the chief himself. Then Chanatu's squad assumed that in that case, the warriors must have received higher quality training. But Chanatu stated that they had no idea how the chief trains. It's not even training. It's real hell. Meanwhile, the sands of the Red Desert were cut through by a sailing ship. On board was a squad of elves from the forest of the Mother Tree, and the squad was commanded by an elven archer named Vinari. At that moment, the ship with her squad was bombarding the demonic portal, striving to stop its formation. The final blow was supposed to be a shot by Vinari herself, which would cause a powerful explosion. However, when the sand settled, everyone on the ship saw that even after that, the portal was still intact. And in the next moment, a ship emerged from it, as if made from darkness itself. And this shadow vessel set course directly for Vinari's ship, intending to ram it. The ship's captain immediately ordered a course change and an increase in speed. The crew promptly executed the order, causing the ship to heel sharply while performing an evasive maneuver. And only at the last second did it manage to avoid the collision. However, to the crew's great surprise, the shadow ship turned around at incredible speed and gave chase. Vinari had never seen anything like this before, but she intended to finish off the unknown enemy with an arrow of light. However, to the surprise of the elven archer, her most powerful attack did not reach its target. Someone deflected it, and in the next moment Vinari saw a demon on the ship's bow who was attacking the sorcerer. And behind him, on the deck, a squad of undead appeared from the clumps of darkness. Meanwhile, the captain ordered to smash the enemy ship to pieces before it got closer. And in the next moment, the crew opened fire on the enemy with all the cannons. However, the sorcerer uttered a spell in an unknown language, and at that very second, a wall of sand rose in front of his ship, absorbing the entire blow. Then Vinari ordered her squad to open fire, and immediately a hail of arrows flew towards the ghost ship. The sorcerer once again took cover behind the wall of sand, but the elven arrows managed to pass through it and reach the enemy deck. With a single volley, the elves thinned the crowd of skeletons by half. Meanwhile, Vinari aimed at the sorcerer. She shot the arrow of light again, but as before, the sorcerer deflected it. And then he spoke to Vinari using telepathy and said that she smelled pleasant. In response, the elven archer declared that the sorcerer smelled of rot. Then he became curious about how Vinari would smell when her body began to rot. Meanwhile, the captain ordered the crew to load the cannons with magical crystals and attack the enemy with all their might. They immediately carried out the order, striking the enemy ship with all the guns. Then the sorcerer summoned the sand wall again, but this time the projectiles pierced it through and finally hit the target. The first mate warned the captain that at this rate the magical crystals would soon run out, but he ordered to use everything that remained. However, the sorcerer declared that the humans were trying in vain, and the next moment the ghost ship restored all the damage it had received. At this, the sorcerer decided to end the acquaintance, but in farewell he promised that they would meet again soon. And the next moment the ghost ship was completely submerged in sand. Meanwhile, in the Inama Empire, the emperor invited Hiruna to a business talk over lunch. His Highness had heard rumors about Julian's return, so he asked Hiruna if she was planning to visit her father. But in response, the girl assured that she would have to endure, as she had not yet completed her training. And moreover, the journey home would take several months. The emperor praised Hiruna's wise decision and admitted that when he himself was still a prince, he did not see his father for several years because he had many affairs. However, in his thoughts, the emperor added that it was precisely because of this that he was able to eliminate all competitors. Then he mentioned that there was no ambassador from Perea in the empire because there was Hiruna, and therefore he asked, "Is there anything she would like to convey to her homeland?" Then in response, the girl reminded that for several years Perea had been asking to send reinforcements due to demon activity. But the emperor stated that Perea was asking to send as many as 10,000, and added that this number was completely absurd. However, Hiruna did not object. On the contrary, she agreed with the emperor and said that Perea itself would not even send a battalion of archers. The emperor only reminded that the empire also lacked hands, as complete chaos was happening because of the portals. Then Hiruna hinted that if such a great power as the empire lacked hands, then it must be very hard for the people in the desert. And then the girl recalled a recent conversation with Luna, who had contacted her through a magical sphere. The requested scale of reinforcements was beyond reasonable limits, so Hiruna confidently stated that the emperor would refuse. But Luna calmed the young lady and explained that this way she would have more freedom to act. Now that the chieftain has returned, the emperor understands that this time the empire must yield. However, Hiruna must ensure that instead of troops, the empire buys off with treasures. Then the girl asked in surprise whether the tribe did not need more people, to which Luna explained that it is more important now to strengthen their positions, and therefore treasures are more important than people. And this is exactly what Hiruna was now trying to achieve from the emperor. Meanwhile, he assured that there are enough monsters on their side, so the empire has no free warriors to send reinforcements. Then, Hiruna again agreed with the emperor and added that besides, the empire is at war with one of the western kingdoms. But in her thoughts, the girl thought with annoyance how difficult it is to deal with such a brazen and unpleasant person, but she needs to learn diplomacy. However, the emperor suspected that Hiruna had some other hidden intentions. He also admitted to himself that he envied Julian because he did not have such smart children. Meanwhile, the desert chieftain gathered all the candidates selected for the squad for further testing. The test was that all the newcomers would have to attack Julian at once. Half of the warriors were stunned by such a turn of events. However, there were those who saw this as a chance to prove themselves. And while Julian was warming up, Shubion explained to the warriors that those among them who managed to wound the chieftain even slightly would receive leave and many high-quality magical crystals. Such a reward gave the warriors courage, and one of them was the first to risk challenging the chieftain to a duel. But Shubion explained that this was not a one-on-one duel. The warriors of the third and fourth waves had to attack all together. This condition puzzled the warriors, as they were being called to forget about honor and attack en masse. But then Julian asked the warriors how, with such courage, they could call themselves the future of the desert. And the chieftain added that a new selection should be held, because random newcomers were better than this gang before him. His words fired up the fighters, and they rushed into the attack as a crowd. Now Julian liked the warriors' spirit, and he met them with a satisfied smirk. And then what began could not even be called a battle. Julian simply walked through the crowd of warriors, scattering them like blind kittens. He avoided vital points but struck only the most painful ones, and even with numerical superiority, the entire group of warriors could not touch the chieftain. Shubion thought that he had finally caught up with Julian, but now he wondered, how strong is the leader? Meanwhile, the warriors of the first and second waves nostalgically watched the training and recalled their first clash with the leader. However, soon Shubion approached them and declared that it was unbecoming of the elders to just watch while the younger comrades suffered. While the leader was absent, the Red Storm risked their lives for all 10 years and successfully carried out dangerous operations, so the squad must show what it has achieved. However, in response, the warriors told the general that if he led the attack, they would cover the rear. Shubeon realized that he had trapped himself, and if his squad could not give a worthy resistance, it would be a terrible disgrace. Therefore, he accepted the challenge and led his fighters into the attack. Meanwhile, the sounds of the fight attracted Garyon, who was patrolling the area with his squad. However, climbing onto a sand dune and seeing Julian, one of the captains of the Red Storm, was horrified. His warriors immediately became alert when Garyon suddenly crouched and ordered everyone not to show themselves. 2 fighters still approached their commander and asked what the problem was, to which Garyon told them to look down. But seeing what was below, the warriors quickly hid behind the sand dune, as did their commander, and then all 3 decided to wait until nightfall. Meanwhile, in the Inima Empire, Hiruna continued to debate with the emperor. His Majesty stated that he would not want to ignore the request of the allied Pareya, and therefore he intends to send about 20 knights and 1,000 infantrymen with archers there. However, in response to the proposal, Hiruna asked the emperor if he might be overdoing it, as she had heard that recently 3 new portals had appeared in the empire. Because of them, chaos was currently happening at the border, so Hiruna asked if the empire could provide support despite this. In response, the emperor explained that since Julian had returned, he should send a gift to Pareya, as the empire had not yet been able to fulfill any of the requests. Then Hiruna assured that if necessary, her father would ask for the gift himself, and His Majesty would do well to show how much he cares about the allied Pareya. In that case, the emperor reasoned that since he could not send people, he should at least send resources. In response, Hiruna stood up from the table and expressed His Majesty the deepest gratitude on behalf of all Pareya. However, in her thoughts, the girl wondered, what would Luna say about this? Meanwhile, the kingdom of Rossini was attacked by demons. The knights outnumbered them, but the demons were stronger. However, on the kingdom's side was its sword, Isaac von Devian, who could defeat even giant monsters with a single strike. And Isaac also possessed healing magic and could heal even severely wounded soldiers on the battlefield. But there were still many demons, so he ordered his men to retreat. They did not object because they knew the power of their prince. And in the next moment, Isaac burst into the crowd of demons, beheading them one by one. But even in the heat of battle, he did not stop thinking about his decision to go to the Red Desert. Isaac was very worried, and there was no time left to think, but whatever the outcome, this was all he could do now. And when the last demon fell, Isaac said that now all that remains is to hope that he made the right choice. But his words were heard by the wisest, Ariel, who approached and admitted that she also sincerely hoped so. When night fell over the ruined city, the knights set up camp in the square. Guards stood watch on the fortress walls. But that night, Isaac himself volunteered to stand guard and ordered them to rest. And when the guards left, he smiled, thinking that fortunately, the soldiers had not lost their fighting spirit. However, the damage inflicted on the city was greater than Isaac had expected. Although this was a condition for the journey into the desert, if he had been late, there could have been many more casualties. Only the words of the wisest kept Isaac restless. Now, left alone with his thoughts, he immersed himself in memories and returned to the present day. The wisest found him in the middle of the ruined city, and then Isaac asked, did she not change her opinion after what she saw? But in response, Ariel said firmly no. She also very much hopes that her choice will ultimately prove to be correct, and after today she still feels that the choice was right. Isaac objected, reminding that many people die because of the portals. Then the wisest asked, could today's situation have prevented the worst scenario? After all, it is precisely because of the portals that a war with the Silence Empire is out of the question. Faced with such an argument, Isaac was forced to admit that Ariel was right, but that was the whole problem. Then the wisest declared that bloodshed is inevitable. But isn't it better to shed the blood of monsters rather than people? At that moment, Isaac could not deny it, even though he had no other choice. And now he only has to keep moving forward and believe that he made the right choice. Meanwhile, Julian and Shubeon finished training and were now exhausted, lying on the sand. The chief praised his friend, for he had become much stronger and even almost defeated him, but such words only made Shubeon even angrier. All these 10 years he wanted to fight alongside Julian against the demons, but the chief asked, who then would lead the Red Storm? In response, Shubeon stubbornly stated that a heavy burden is always easier to carry together, but Julian objected, saying that he was already carrying enough. And also, only thanks to Shubeon was he able to calmly handle everything. But then Shubeon realized and asked, had Julian seen Orca, to which the chief said that he had no fewer affairs than Luna. Then Shubeon assured that Julian would be surprised to learn how much his brother had changed. But the chief already knew this, for there were not many men in the Provoc family, so Orca had to become stronger. But then Julian grew sad, remembering how the teacher told him to always be ready, and the chief also recalled Noah's last words, that one day the time would come and then he would have to make a decision. But do these words mean that the 3 seals will be removed? And maybe they have already been removed, and now Julian also cannot stay aside. Meanwhile, in the Inama Empire, Hiruna finished the meeting with the emperor and was now heading to the carriage to return to the residence. At the carriage, Mene, her personal bodyguard from the Parea tribe, was patiently waiting for the girl, and also 2 knights of the empire, assigned personally by the emperor, Modin and Kasich. When Hiruna approached the carriage, Mane politely inquired how everything went, to which he received a positive answer. And when the girl climbed inside, the carriage started moving and left the imperial palace. On the way to the residence, Hiruna suddenly asked Mane for forgiveness for causing so much trouble today. But for the experienced warrior, it was a great honor to help the young lady, for which Hiruna was very grateful and promised to repay Mane when they both returned home. However, then the girl noticed that she had never seen this road before, which immediately made Mane wary. Then he looked outside and asked Modin, who was riding nearby, why are they taking a different road? However, the puzzled knight answered the question with a question. Didn't Mane order the coachman to stop by the mansion on the way to the residence? But Mane did not give such instructions. Then Modin ordered his partner to approach the coachman from the opposite side of the carriage. But to the surprise of both knights, the coachman simply disappeared. Modin immediately warned Mane about the situation and tried to intercept the reins. But in the next moment, he was knocked off the carriage by an enemy projectile. However, Modin managed to curl up during the fall and landed safely on the ground. Kasich intended to go back for him, but Modin ordered him not to stop. The breastplate saved the knight's life, but from the force of the blow, he guessed that it was not an arrow, but a crossbow bolt, and if so, the shooter was somewhere nearby. Also, Modin realized that the coachman was in league with the attackers, which meant everything was planned in advance and they were hunting the princess. Therefore, he called his horse and rushed into pursuit. Meanwhile, Mane took the coachman's place and took control of the carriage. However, the enemies were already approaching it from both sides. Nevertheless, Hiruna remained calm. She realized that these were not just bandits, but who in the Inam Empire could dare to kidnap her? Hiruna decided to personally ask the kidnappers about this and jumped onto the roof, having previously broken through it. At such a sight, Kasich was stunned, but immediately pulled himself together and shouted to the princess that it was dangerous. But Hiruna only smiled, calmed the knight, and thanked him for his concern. Then she took off her belt and declared that she could stand up for herself perfectly well. And in the next moment, Hiruna infused the belt with her ki, and it straightened like a sword. A fight was inevitable, so Mane told his lady that if he suddenly became a burden to her, she should leave him. However, in response, Hiruna assured that she would not allow that. Meanwhile, the bandits took the carriage in a pincer movement, and one of them was the first to shoot from a crossbow. But Kasich managed to deflect the bolt with his sword. Then, following their leader, all the other bandits opened fire. Kasich barely managed to deflect most of the bolts, but one still grazed his shoulder. Then, in response, the knight shot a beam of concentrated ki from the tip of his sword. He aimed at the bandit leader, but the latter shielded himself with a crossbow. However, then, instead of continuing the fight, the leader suddenly declared that he did not intend to kill Kasich and those he protects. But the knight did not believe the bandit's words and ordered Mane to ride on, while he himself would stay to hold off the enemies. However, in the next moment, a ki beam struck the bandit leader like an arrow and knocked him off his horse. And when Kasich turned around, he saw that the shooter was Lady Hiruna. Meanwhile, Julian decided to visit the mother tree, thanks to which a green meadow blossomed in the midst of the scorching desert. However, soon the Orc tribe's supreme warrior, Humbaba, joined the chieftain. Upon meeting, Julian once again expressed his gratitude to him, for if not for Humbaba, the Parea tribe would have faced great difficulties. But the Orc warrior assured that there was no need for awkward words, as he had seen the greatness of human fighters with his own eyes. Julian guessed that Humbaba was talking about the mages of Parea, and stated that the Orc's war cry contains a special power, so useful in the desert terrain. The Orc was surprised by the chief's praise and asked, "Aren't the war cry and magic of the Parea mages similar?" But in response, Julian regretfully admitted that after many years of useless bloodshed, the desert tribes had lost what they should have been developing, and therefore Parea would need the strength of the Orc clan warriors. However, Humbaba warned that his tribe also needed something, so this was not help, but cooperation. Then the Orc asked the chief if he knew that monsters change, to which Julian assured that his tribe was already working on solving this problem. Then Humbaba warned that time was not on their side, and therefore all human tribes must unite. However, in response, Julian said nothing, only wondering, wouldn't it be too selfish to use the selfishness of the continent's peoples? At this, Humbaba decided to leave the chief, and warning about joint training with the pariah warriors one last time, departed. But as soon as the Orc disappeared, in the next moment, a worried Garian ran up to Julian and asked on the run, "Hasn't Shubeon returned yet?" Julian replied that not yet, and if you look at it that way, Shubeon was delayed more than usual. Then Garian stated that they would have to wait longer because the portals were not closing. At these words, the chief's focused face twitched. But for now, the story returns to Henkel Fortress. This place has long served as a crossroads of roads connecting the desert and the eastern continent. But now Henkel is different. Thanks to the strong alliance between Parea and the Silence Empire, a safe route to the Red Desert has opened. Thus, the current Henkel has turned into the richest and most prosperous city on the continent. And everything that happens in Henkel does not go unnoticed by its wise ruler Haisha. On this day he, together with his wife Syra, was receiving an ambassador from the Parea tribe named Boisha. He arrived in Henkel with a warning of a second-level threat. Haisha pondered the words of his old friend and asked to buy a little more time for Henkel and the Silence Empire. However, in response, Boisha stated that the tribe did not have time for that, and if it was still quiet in the east, then in the west, pure hell was happening. Then Syra intervened in the conversation and assured the ambassador that he could speak freely, since regardless of status, she was Haisha's wife, and Henkel's affairs also concerned her. Boisha apologized to the princess and explained that he could not help but worry now. Then Haisha asked if it was really that serious, to which Boisha revealed that everything in the desert was changing very quickly and radically, and meanwhile, no one had yet sent them the promised support. Nevertheless, Haisha asked to wait a little longer, as ambassadors were arriving from other countries. But in response, Boisha explained that the problem was not with Julian, but with the leaders of other desert tribes. They were no longer just expressing dissatisfaction. They were angry. Even Luna spoke at the meeting of the Supreme Desert Council and asked to give Haisha more time, but the people's patience was running out. Then Haisha replied that he needed to think everything over to give an accurate answer. Meanwhile, Julian led the squad, rushing to the outskirts of the Red Desert. The current situation affected not only the desert, so the leader listened to Humbaba's words and decided to see everything for himself. But upon arriving at the third village in a row, Julian was met with the same terrible scene. The village was located on the edge of the desert, but its inhabitants were still not spared. For the leader, this was unacceptable, but the worst part was that it was no longer just about the Red Desert. Now this problem concerned all humanity. But fortunately for Julian, there were still demons left in the village on whom he could vent his rage. Therefore, the leader ordered the squad to crush the enemies and was the first to rush into the attack. After clearing the village, the squad returned to the oasis, where Julian decided to wash up to clear his mind. But soon, Per approached him, clearly intending to discuss the recently made decision. However, the chief stopped him and stated that if he had seen everything with his own eyes, he would not have objected to his decision. Innocent people are now helplessly dying, so Julian asked his brother to put politics aside and put people first. In response, Pere assured that he would follow the chief's wish, but other desert chiefs would not so easily follow his will. Then Julian declared that if he did not take a step forward while his people were dying, he would have to accept the consequences. Pere realized that his brother was truly very angry and asked him to act consistently in that case. However, in response, Julian said there was no time for that and ordered all units to be sent out. Pere tried to reason with the chief, but Julian explained that Perea must make other countries understand that if it cannot fulfill its duty, then no one else can. After that, Pere met with Luna and recounted the conversation with his brother. The chief's decision puzzled Luna, because instead of bringing reinforcements, he first tried to bring resources. Meanwhile, Pere warned that he would like to ask Orku to investigate the problem with the portals. In response, Luna assured that he would do everything possible to help, to which Pere expressed hope that under the current circumstances, they could both leave disputes behind and start anew. But Luna never held a grudge against Pere, because they both were simply following their beliefs for the sake of the tribe. Meanwhile, Julian visited Madame Matata, who once took the place of his mother. However, when he knelt before her, Matata said that the chief is the hope of the tribe, and therefore he must stand above all others. And Madame also heard that the chief had made a decision and wants to seal the demon world. However, Julian admitted that he did not know how to do this, so he came to Madame for advice. But in response, Matata assured him that this would not be difficult, since the chief had already known Valhalla. Julian was surprised by Madame's insight and asked, "What will happen next?" Then Matata told that there would be a final war, but its battlefield would be beyond the desert. Then Madame headed to the exit of the tent and ordered Julian to follow her. He asked confusedly where they were going, to which Matata vaguely replied that with the help of the Sheer tribe, she would show the way, and then noble warriors of Valhalla would join the chief. Meanwhile, in the Inama Empire, the chase continued. Hiruna ordered Mana to stop the carriage, to which the bodyguard exclaimed that this was unacceptable. Then the girl reminded who her teacher, father, and uncles were. Manet had nothing to say against such an argument, and therefore he was forced to comply. As soon as the crew stopped, they were immediately surrounded by bandits. Then their leader stepped forward and admitted that he did not expect such mastery of ki from Hiruna. The chief almost died, yet he had no intention of harming the girl. On the contrary, the bandits would be very grateful for cooperation. But in response, Hiruna stated that in such a situation, it was not a request, but a threat. Then she turned to Kasich and asked the knight to turn the carriage around and move away. Hiruna asked the same of the bandits, but their leader warned that if the girl continued to resist, they would have to show roughness. In response, Hiruna ordered the bandits to disappear from her sight if they did not want to die. The bandit leader was forced to admit that the girl was much more skillful than he had expected. However, to the chief, Hiruna was just an immature and conceited girl, so he drew his blade. Then Hiruna declared that although she did not know who sent the bandits, that person entrusted the task to someone who does not even understand people. Then the girl jumped down from the carriage and, preparing for battle, added that in any case she would have to find out who the employer was. The leader realized that nothing could be done and said to his men with annoyance that it wouldn't be terrible if they broke something of the girl's. The main thing was that she stayed alive. And in the next moment, the bandits rushed at Hiruna from all sides. However, in response, the girl sharply swung her belt, and it, writhing like a snake, pierced the neck of the first enemy. The second was a bit luckier. He survived, but Hiruna cut off his arm. Then she beheaded 2 bandits with one swing. Kasich and Mane also joined the fight, and soon the first wave of bandits was destroyed. Then the leader ordered the remaining ones to encircle Hiruna, but she spun like a top and threw the bandits away with a powerful wave of Kai. However, this was only a distraction, and in the next moment the leader attacked the girl from behind. But to his surprise, Hiruna, without turning, deflected the treacherous attack. Then her belt rushed at the leader, but he managed to put his blade under the strike. However, this did not save the bandit, as the belt simply broke his sword. And in the next moment, the belt wrapped around the leader, completely immobilizing him. Then Hiruna stated that so she spared several bandits, so she had no reason to leave their leader alive. He could not move and only now, to his horror, realized that the girl was much stronger than him. The leader tried to speak, but it was already too late. Hiruna sharply pulled the belt, and it cut the bandit into pieces. Main, who was watching what was happening, had to admit that even the chief could not use half of the lady's current strength at her age. But then Hiruna addressed him and ordered to arrest the bandits who were still alive. But Kasich wondered if the princess had overdone it, since she could quite easily capture all the bandits alive. However, his thoughts were interrupted by Hiruna herself, who ordered to check if Lord Moden was all right. Soon the crew resumed their journey, but Kasich kept casting thoughtful glances at the princess. They were hard to miss, so Hiruna asked, "Did Lord Kasich have something to say?" He was confused by the question, and then Hiruna guessed that it was because of what had recently happened. The princess explained that if she had finished off all the bandits, she would not have found out who the employer was, and if she had spared them all, they would have considered her weak. Since it is impossible to prevent a recurrence of such an event, it is necessary to make the enemies pay, and those who survived break and tell the truth. After Hiruna's words, Kasich had no more questions, and he also began to understand why Emperor Mardung was so favorable to her. Meanwhile, Julian, accompanied by Vinari and Kambaba, arrived at the Sheer tribe. On his behalf, the guests were met and greeted by the priestess Lakri. However, soon the girl was surprised to see Lady Matata together with the conqueror of the desert. She was very glad to see Lakri again after so many years and suggested continuing the conversation inside the tower. There, Julian revealed his plan to oppose the demons with the strength of all the squads. In response, Lakri declared without hesitation that if necessary, she was ready to summon the full power of the Sheer tribe to help the conqueror of the desert. Julian was glad to hear this, but warned that first of all it was necessary to train the warriors in the power of the forgotten song of the supreme warrior Kambaba. The priestess agreed that the warrior's song would undoubtedly help greatly in the fight against monsters, but it could not be mastered in a short time. Then Lady Matata explained that if a person who was not a warrior wanted to master the song, it would require a lot of time and effort. But for the warriors of Perea, there was nothing easier. However, Lakri warned that it still might not be as simple as it seemed. She also revealed that in her youth Lady Matata was part of the Sheer tribe, which surprised Julian. However, Matata calmly stated that the mages of the Sheer tribe are not warriors. Lakri did not dare to argue further, and assured that the Sheer tribe would make every effort to help Perea. Then Matata warned that there was one more request. They would have to open Valhalla. At these words, the priestess was horrified and declared that this place was not meant for living beings. But Lady Matata calmed her and explained that only Julian, who had already been there once, would enter Valhalla. With that, the conversations ended, and the warriors of Perea immediately began training, immersing themselves in the illusion of emptiness. One of the first volunteers was Garyon with his squad. Lady Matata and Lakri watched his training through a magical sphere, but the priestess expressed concerns that at this rate, the warriors would soon breathe their last. But Matata assured that all who arrived in the Sheer tribe were the best warriors of Perea, and they would never lose to the illusion, falling into its trap. Then Lakri reminded that these warriors simply were not ready for this, to which Matata lamented that the priestess mistrusted them without reason. Then the lady pointed to Garyon fighting the illusion and declared that fear would not be able to seize them. When the day leaned toward sunset, the training ended and Garyon with his squad emerged from the illusion. Only in his thoughts did the tired captain declare that if it happens again, it will be the end for all of them. Meanwhile, Lakri was watching the warriors, unable to believe her eyes. For although all the warriors were completely exhausted, they really managed to survive the trial. But Lady Matata did not doubt for a second and declared that in just a month the warriors would definitely be able to do it. However, from the words of the elder Garyon and his fighters, they thought that perhaps they would reach Valhalla even before her. And the one who definitely had already reached Valhalla before everyone else was Julian. He was greeted by statues of great warriors of the past, who in unison proclaimed the return of the young warrior who had become worthy of their praise. In response, Julian bowed his head and respectfully greeted the warriors of the past as the desert chieftain. Then the central statue, seated on the throne, declared that Julian had become a warrior worthy to share a conversation with them. For Julian, it was a great honor to meet again with the chieftain of the past. But in response, he declared that now Julian had also become a chieftain, and it was his generation that would end the war. Then Julian swore that no matter what, he would put an end to it, for his ancestors also needed eternal peace. The chief of the past agreed with Julian and assured that all warriors would support his entry into Valhalla. However, Julian was somewhat worried, so he asked the chief of the past for help with the decision. In response, the chief of the past pondered and asked what exactly is required of him. Meanwhile, at the Silence Empire Academy, another lesson was taking place. However, specifically in this class, among the students was a native of the Parea tribe named Ahan. His teacher decided to end the lesson for today, and giving homework as a last task, dismissed the class. But unlike his peers, Ahan was in no hurry to leave, continuing to diligently reread his notes. He might have sat like that until evening if Rolbys had not called out to him. Ahan snapped out of it, and in response to his friend's question, explained that he was simply trying to understand the material on his own. In response, Rolbys was amazed, because Ahan was still able to maintain concentration after a 4-hour lesson. Moreover, Ahan was the best fighter in the class, and even martial arts masters learned from him. Therefore, Rolbys asked, could he invite Ahan home? In response, he suggested that Rolbys needed a fencing teacher. But Rolbys got a little nervous and admitted that he needed something from Ahan, or rather, he depended on her. Then Ahan also admitted that he was rereading the notes for the 3rd time, but still couldn't grasp it, so he needed a friend's help. Having agreed, Ahan and Rolbys left the building and headed to the dining hall through the academy courtyard. However, at the threshold, they were ambushed by Haisha, who jokingly expressed surprise at the book in Ahan's hands. But Ahan was genuinely surprised to see the great desert warrior so suddenly. Then Ahan realized and introduced Haisha to his study friend and heir of the Duke, Rolbys. He pondered over Haisha's name and title, which he had heard somewhere before. But in the next moment, Rolbys was enlightened, for before him stood the lord of the city Henkel and the emperor's son-in-law. Therefore, he immediately bowed his head and introduced himself as befits a lord. Haisha was glad to meet Rolbys, but asked to be left alone with Ahan. And when the young lord left, Ahan guessed that Haisha had come not without reason. Although Ahan arrived at the Silence Academy reluctantly because of the chieftain and Haisha's persistent recommendations, once here he understood a lot and learned much. Therefore, Ahan wanted to stay at the academy longer to learn even more. Haisha would have been only glad about this, but due to recent events, Ahan might have to pause his studies. Meanwhile, Julian, together with Lakri, watched the warriors' training. The chieftain noticed that the training was hard for them, but when he was in charge, it was not so serious. Then the priestess asked, "Does Julian want to learn the warrior's song?" In response, the chieftain pondered, but then declared that he would like to know why his warriors were in such difficulty. At that time, Lady Matata came to the shore of the Shadow Sea. She did not know how much her idea would help, but as long as Julian was there, she would not have to worry much about the future. The last thing Matata could do was to dedicate herself to the tribe and sacrifice herself for the new kingdom. Therefore, with a pure soul, she began preparing her final spell. Finding himself inside the illusion where his tribesmen had already been, Julian was surprised. After all, it was quite difficult to be here and very hard to move. Besides, Julian could not see what surrounded him. After several blows from Julian, the space could no longer hold and began to crack. Here, Julian was very surprised that his warriors had difficulties with this, since for Garion, it should not have been a problem. Watching everything through the Lakri sphere, she was amazed at how Julian destroyed space using only force. Although what did she expect? After all, Julian had already gone beyond human capabilities. Meanwhile, in the inner palace of silence, Emperor Sheon and his son-in-law Haisha were having a conversation. Emperor Sheon did not like all this, even though the Empire and the Kingdom of Parea were allies. But this time, Parea went too far, as this is already interference in the internal affairs of the Empire. But Kaisha disagreed with him, because if the Empire does not send troops to the border for a sweep, they will face retribution. Initially, the envoys from Parea repeatedly asked for help, but the empire simply ignored their requests. The emperor was outraged. Could it really be his fault? But Haisha did not intend to threaten Xion. He only wanted to emphasize how critical the current situation was. The emperor's face darkened. Now the empire is in a difficult position. The kingdom of Rossini is just waiting for the moment to strike. Due to recovery from the civil war, the emperor could not pay more attention to this, but now it was necessary to take advantage of the opportunity and regain the territories. Of course, Haisha believed that the emperor was doing the right thing, but now was not the time. Nevertheless, the emperor did not understand why he needed to delay such a great matter because of this situation. After all, Julian had returned. Then Haisha tried to explain to Emperor Xion the importance of the current events. Perea had reached its limit, and such a decision was made by the leader. Xion nodded approvingly, but he was still worried that even if he mobilized troops and provided support, the kingdom of Rossini might try to provoke them. But Haisha assured him that the kingdom of Rossini would not dare to act that way. After all, in that case, Perea's wrath would be directed at them. Emperor Xion raised an eyebrow in surprise. Could Perea really be ready to go to war? Of course, Haisha perfectly understood that the empire and the kingdom of Rossini were covering for each other, and it was time to put an end to this conflict. This matter concerned not only the empire, but also the kingdom of Rossini, so they notified all countries bordering Perea, but the emperor was skeptical about whether the other countries would listen to them, and Haisha understood his concerns. There might be countries that would not comply, but then they would see Perea's wrath. And then the emperor thought, perhaps this is a good chance for the empire to realize its ambitions. Meanwhile, Matata continued to sing on the shore of the Shadow Sea. Behind her, Lakri and the elder were watching intently through the sphere. Lakri was amazed by Matata's efforts, but worried whether she was overexerting herself, as it was already the third day of her singing. Of course, Lakri understood that to open the path for the tribe, Pare would need about a month, and most likely there would be casualties. That is why Lady Matata is trying so hard to open the path herself for the sake of her king. Finally, Lady Matata finished singing, and pillars of light shot from the seal into the sky. Julian, who was nearby, was amazed. Could it be that when Matata said she would show the way, it was literal? Matata, gathering the last of her strength, directed the beam of light onto the Shadow Sea. Julian's eyes widened in surprise. The Shadow Sea receded where the beam of light passed, revealing a path to him. But Lady Matata's strength was leaving her, and she staggered. The chief immediately rushed to her. Of course, Julian felt that Matata's life force was running out, but why go so far? But Matata only smiled in response. It was said that for the members of the Sheer tribe, opening the path would be difficult, but still possible. She was ready to sacrifice herself just to fulfill the promise given to the leader. Matata was also part of Perea, so she, like the warriors, sacrificed herself for the people. She should have left long ago. Matata was even surprised that she had lived so long. But now she understood everything. All this was for this day. For her, it was an honor to help all the tribes. Sadness appeared on Julian's face, but Lady Matata asked the leader not to be sad, but to smile at her farewell. And Julian sincerely smiled in response. Lady Matata only nodded approvingly and released the leader's hand. Slowly, her body began to turn into small clusters of light, which soared into the sky. Julian remembered his childhood and how Lady Matata had replaced his mother. Raising his gaze upward, he watched the clusters of light dissolving in the sky. Turning around, he looked at the opened passage. Matata's sacrifice must not be in vain, so Julian must seal it. Meanwhile, Haisha was about to leave the Silence Empire Academy. Next to him was a worried Ahan. Haisha was simply preparing for the worst-case scenario. Although they had uncovered the truth, he did not know how the Emperor would react to it. Then Ahan asked what he could do at the Academy, but Haisha only shook his head negatively. Peace in the desert and calm on the streets of Silence depended only on the Emperor. After all, if the Emperor does not take measures and chaos begins, the students from the desert studying at the academy will have a hard time. Here, Ahan unexpectedly suggested taking all the students from the desert. Perhaps this would put pressure on the Emperor. To which Haisha only smiled in response. Ahan had learned a lot and was already proposing political steps. But at this moment, that was enough. Therefore, Haisha advised Ahan to warn the princes of the kingdoms and the heirs of the great houses about the danger. Meanwhile, a meeting was taking place in Perea, and although Luna had already sent requests to all the countries with which they had diplomatic relations, there was little hope. One of the advisors objected that maybe something would change, since the leader, warrior, and protector of Perea had returned. But Luna was skeptical. Some changes had indeed occurred, but they only concerned those who felt the leader's power. The Silence Empire, the Inama Empire, and the Kingdom of Rosini at least formally demonstrated cooperation, but the others would most likely continue to ignore the requests as before. For Shubeon, such a development of events was expected, which is why they could no longer remain inactive. It was necessary to complete the hero's path as soon as possible. Only by completing it could Perea give the desert a powerful weapon. Of course, Luna understood that many of those present still doubted the hero's path. Therefore, they planned to carry out an operation to demonstrate the power of the weapon that Perea held in its hands. This was supposed to serve as a warning to those who simply remain on the sidelines. They would have to understand that the desert carries a heavy burden and learn what will happen if they neglect the duty to bear this burden. The advisors nodded approvingly. Of course, Luna wanted to use this move much later, but now it was more important to give the chief's rage an outlet. Orca studied the shards that had separated from the portal nearby with interest. Suddenly, his attention was drawn by one of the warriors pointing out that an enemy was behind Orca. Striking the staff on the ground, Orca cast a binding spell on the monster, and then using light magic, dispersed the creature. Staring at the pile of ashes, Orca wondered if all the gates in the future would be like this, then monsters would appear endlessly. Of course, he did not know for sure whether they would be able to find a way to close the gates forever, since much still remained unclear. Meanwhile, Juliana inside the space was trying to master the art of song while fighting countless enemies. Striking down opponents one by one, Julian continued to sing without stopping. Finally, using heavenly destruction, the last monster was defeated, but it was of little use. Did Julian still need to learn more? Behind him, Lakri and the elders watched with interest through the sphere. They were surprised that the warrior's song had no effect on the god of war. At first, Lakri thought the aura was too weak, but then it disappeared. Perhaps Julian was already accustomed to the warrior's song. Of course, Lakri also understood that preserving the traditions of the desert was their sacred duty. And if they did not solve this problem, they would lose the respect of the other tribes. Then one of the elders expressed concerns that the god of war thinks like most warriors who consider singing meaningless. But Lakri immediately dismissed this theory, since the entire Red Storm believed that the warrior's song could be beneficial. So why would the god of war ignore it? After all, Julian went against prejudices and even implemented the Imperial Academy system. A deadly silence hung. The elders and Lakri did not know what to do next. Then one of the elders named Ian suggested that since Julian is the god of war, the warrior's song is a lower order power, so it probably does not affect him. But the other elders did not support Ian and only resented his guess, since the god of war still remains a warrior. And the warrior's song is an epic encompassing the history of the desert. No matter how great Julian was, he could not rise above the history of the entire desert. But Ian's words made Lakri think. Perhaps it could be true. Therefore, she decided to head to the library, and the remaining elders were to oversee the training of the other warriors. Near the mother tree, Per met with Lady Vinari and her retinue. Bowing his head in greeting, Per thanked her for the work done. Madame Vinari handed him the report that was requested to be delivered to the Pare tribe. Carefully studying the reports, Per's eyes widened in horror. It was necessary to prepare. The crisis was from all sides, and if it continued like this, the fleet would not be able to enter the required zones, and this would complicate troop movements. Pere decided to immediately convene a meeting, suggesting Vinari also attend. She only nodded affirmatively, as if following someone's plan to change everything at once from the beginning. The desert was on the edge. It was already night outside, and Lakri continued her searches in the library. Suddenly she was struck with insight. The warrior's song is a way to embody the ancestors' epic in the present, to gain their strength. But the epic built by the current god of war was much stronger than any desert story. That is why weaker songs could not help him. The chief's epic was missing only one part, and if the song dedicated precisely to it was used, then the song should bring benefit. Meanwhile, Julian, having carefully listened to the messenger's report, pondered where to start. There was nothing urgent yet, so Julian decided to trust Perry and Luna. Let them first set the priorities, and then he will personally deal with each item. The messenger, having carefully listened to the orders, immediately rushed to carry them out. Suddenly, Julian's attention was drawn to Lockery, who came out of the nearby gates. She came to inform Julian that she had found the warrior's song that could help him. Being in the space, the warrior of Paray sighed heavily and opened his eyes. Now, before his eyes appeared what he had not seen before. More precisely, a crowd of shadows positioned opposite and preparing to attack. The warrior, beginning to sing, boldly rushed at the enemy, slaying one monster after another. Even when surrounded, he did not stop uttering the words of the song. This helped him scatter the shadows and rush into the attack again. This was what each of the warriors did during training. The words of the song did not cease for a second. Garion also followed the example of his tribesmen and bravely struck the shadows without stopping singing. When the training was finally over, a smile played on Garion's face. Garion had felt something before, but now he could definitely control it at will. The tribesmen also shared his joy. From now on, they could complete tasks independently without the help of the Norn tribe. After all, previously some of the gates could not be passed without them, and because of this many felt uncomfortable. But Garion advised the warriors not to be hasty, for they were not inferior to the Norn tribe in strength. They just could not destroy the special environment close to witchcraft. They should learn from the experience of their predecessors who overcame similar obstacles. But many wondered which song they would learn this time. Of course, Garion was not particularly concerned, since their job was to work with muscles, and the elders of the Shur tribe would explain everything themselves. The warriors were also curious why the chief trained separately, but everyone was confident that Julian would show a stunning result. In the library, Julian studied records about previous chiefs. As he thought there were almost no records, even the corresponding songs were few. For him and Lockery, it was obvious that there was only one warrior, the greatest chief of the desert, Chavaswella, who was the only one to lead the troops in the last battle. Julian believed that he was the only one who could pass on his experience to them. Then Lockery suggested starting with the art of commanding troops, since a song that enhances abilities would clearly be useful to the god of war. Of course, Julian intended to speak separately with the elders and shamans of the tribe, but it was the Shur people who had the most complete historical archives. But Lockery immediately dispelled his concerns by stating that the elders had already begun research, asking the god of war for cooperation. Naturally, Julian was surprised by this turn of events. Could it be that the elders wanted to study him as well? For Lockery, Julian's behavior was completely incomprehensible, since he was the god of war, and their mission was to study history and create a song based on it. But Julian still doubted, thinking he was not great enough for a song to be made about him. Nevertheless, Lockery was determined. There was no time for modesty now. It was necessary to immortalize in song the story of how Julian fought a giant creature in an oasis in the south. Julian recalled that battle but was unable to destroy the monster. Something appeared that interfered with him. The aura of the celestial demon tried to consume it, and in the end he lost control. It was fortunate that everything turned out well. It was not Julian who fought with that black hand, but something else. Something that has now left him. Some kind of creature. And here Julian became worried whether he could resist this creature. His thoughts were interrupted by Lockery, who called him to follow her, as all the elders were already waiting for Julian. Julian was telling the story of his life with interest, and the elders were attentively recording the tale. Of course, Julian felt a little awkward, since it was his own song, but he hoped that the song would help at least a little. The gray-bearded elder thanked Julian for his efforts. The elders recorded his deeds in the chronicles for the sake of fighting evil. Julian's face burned with shame. He felt embarrassed. But the records were supposed to benefit many generations of warriors in the future. Nevertheless, Lockery wanted to ask to be told Julian's true name, the leader of the desert. Because of the civil war, they replaced many elders, and the former priestess left them. Therefore, Lockery was worried that they might miss something, and after all, the work had to be done flawlessly. Lockery also wanted to gather the chief shamans of all the tribes on behalf of the leader. They had to make up for the shortcomings of the Sheer tribe. Of course, she understood that everyone was busy because of the monster activity, but warriors who mastered the song became much stronger. Julian indeed noted that the effect was impressive, especially since they had the opportunity to solve problems without the involvement of the Norn tribe. Lockery thanked the leader for his participation, but she needed to ask a few more questions. After all, they needed a song that would allow them to respond immediately to anomalies. Also, Lockery was informed that there is a magical fleet in Perea, and without it, the warriors could not cope with the emerging anomalies. And with the help of the warrior's song, it would be possible to deal with these anomalies. Of course, there were some limitations, but they could be avoided. Meanwhile, in Perea, the squad leaders were preparing the fighters for the offensive. Pere, together with Luna and Shubeon, announced to the warriors that they had informed 9 countries bordering Perea of their intentions. However, none of them agreed to meet their demands. Kratos immediately picked up on this, adding that only the Silence Empire and the Kingdom of Rosini were ready to meet the minimum conditions. Nevertheless, they intended to warn those who did not fulfill their fair demands. Then Bakken joined the conversation. Of course, he understood that this might look like shifting responsibility onto others. But since this decision was made at the Great Desert Council, everyone must participate. No one should hesitate. Only then will the other countries understand what the desert has sacrificed. Inspired by such speeches from their commanders, the warriors moved to the gathering point. Although gates appeared all over the continent, more than half of them were still formed in the desert. Other countries had to somehow respond to the desert's requests. They had to be sincere. Of course, Shubeon never neglected his duties, and this method was not to his liking. But he perfectly understood that Perea could not endlessly cope with hordes of monsters alone. At the warriors' gathering point, Luna and Pear were already waiting, watching how the armada of warriors moved. Pear felt a heaviness in his soul. Noticing this, Luna advised him not to show his feelings in front of others. After all, weakness could spread to the other warriors. But it was not weakness. Pear was simply disappointed in the others, the strange ones who thought it would not affect them. Julian ordered to set priorities and report, but Pear did not know what to do first. But Luna was more concerned about the variables in this matter, for there are many madmen in the world, especially among those who have power and opportunities. The operation to protect the desert from monsters, or rather the operation aimed at showcasing the desert's weapons, began. The cavalry swiftly burst into the ranks of monsters, crushing everything in their path. They advanced quickly, giving the beasts no slightest chance to escape. But Shubeon sharply ordered the warriors to stop and not to pursue the retreating monsters. For the essence of the operation was very simple. Instead of destroying the monsters, the desert warriors had to push them in one direction. Shubeon ordered Bakun to form a squad and continue the offensive on the continent. Casting a glance over the battlefield, Shubeon wondered how many more people had to die because of these creatures. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of the continent, farmers were peacefully resting after a hard day. Suddenly, a strange hum reached their ears, which was heard beyond the village palisade. It was the accumulated anger of the desert that began to pour onto the continent. The monsters broke through the palisade and burst into the village. People fled in horror. But the beasts were more agile, throwing themselves at the fugitives and tearing them to pieces. Some villagers, in fear, grabbed pitchforks and other agricultural tools, hoping to somehow defend themselves. But the fate of the bearded old man was sealed. The monster knocked him down and began tearing the poor man's body apart. A young man, paralyzed by fear, fell to the ground, still clutching the pitchforks in his hands. Realizing his unenviable position, the villager was already saying goodbye to life, when suddenly a figure jumped out from behind him and cut the monster in two. This figure turned out to be a girl named Hilai. She advised the shocked villager to go to the village entrance, where he could be protected. Turning around, Hilai noticed 4 more monsters approaching and, hastening the man, bravely rushed into battle. After a moment, all the creatures were defeated, but Hilai did not blink an eye. She was more concerned about whether this was too irresponsible, since too many people end up dying. Feeling movement behind her, Hilai sharply turned and pressed the blade to Justice's throat, who had sneaked up unnoticed. Carefully removing the blade from her neck, Justus reminded Hilai that it was dangerous to move alone. but Hilai immediately advised Justice not to stand behind her if he did not want to die, and she sheathed the sword. Examining the battlefield, Hilai was horrified at how many people had died, but such was the strategy of the Pere tribe. At that moment, Hilai wondered if it was really necessary to resort to such measures. But according to Justice, if other countries did not feel the losses firsthand, they would consider it someone else's problem. Besides, that was the decision of the Desert Council. Of course, Hilai understood this. They were sent on an operation where it was necessary to leave the enemy alive to spread rumors. This operation was meant to show that the desert had not remained indifferent. Moreover, apart from the Red Storm, only Justice's squad could handle the hordes of monsters. After looking around once more and finding no more enemies, Eustace gave the order to retreat. Meanwhile, near the western village, a warrior with light hair named Jirkan led his comrades into battle. The fighters fiercely clashed with the monsters, giving them not a single chance. Jirkan swiftly jumped and plunged a dagger into the head of the nearest monster. Letting out its last breath, the creature collapsed to the ground. But Jirkan did not even think of stopping. Driven by rage, he killed one monster after another. In his soul, Jirkan cursed the chieftain, for he was from the former Yalka tribe, the tribe of traitors. And by the chieftain's decision, warriors of this tribe could not start families for more than 10 years. Such was the price for betrayal. Therefore, Jirkan strove to finish off the monsters as quickly as possible, for as soon as this operation ended, he would finally get the chance to start a family. And the elite desert warriors carried out an operation called Remnants of Conscience. On sand ships, they attacked giant shadow worms, firing volleys from all their weapons. At headquarters, Luna was examining the map with interest and marking the received information about the course of the battles. Although it was burdensome, Luna believed that this way they could pressure the rulers of neighboring countries. And the operation, as expected, turned out to be very effective. The monsters, driven by the desert to the outskirts, attacked the border areas. Because of this, many people were forced to leave their homes and flee. Of course, such a situation caused uncontrollable chaos, and chaos quickly turned into anger. And naturally, anger is a feeling that always finds a way out. In one of the border castles of the Inama Empire, the local duke was extremely outraged that monsters were moving towards his lands. The duke demanded that the troops immediately arrive at the castle, but the garrison commander named Oswald once again reminded the duke that most of the soldiers had deserted. The deserters joined the rebels because their families were there. Oswald insisted on protecting the city residents, but the duke clearly disagreed with him, wanting to protect only the fortress, since without it these lands would not exist at all. Oswald's expression darkened at these words, when suddenly one of the soldiers on the fortress wall called out to him. The guard reported the approach of monsters to the city walls. Oswald immediately climbed the wall to assess the scale of the attack. Oswald's eyes widened with horror when he saw the number of monsters. He immediately asked the Duke to evacuate everyone in the castle at once, but the Duke was against it, demanding that Oswald immediately go out and stop the monsters, as he needed time to carry everything out of the treasury. There was no time for this. Moreover, Oswald did not want to risk the lives of soldiers for the Duke's treasures. But the Duke continued to insist. For him, the lives of soldiers meant nothing. Property was more important. He could not run away from the fortress empty-handed. Oswald could no longer tolerate such blatant selfishness, and with a swing of his sword beheaded the Duke. Then he ordered the soldiers to immediately gather the remaining men and leave the fortress to join the people's militia. Meanwhile, an outraged crowd gathered near the imperial palace. In the throne room, the emperor gloomily listened to the report of his advisors. All in unison demanded that the emperor act immediately, for the monsters were advancing and it was necessary to urgently send troops. The emperor became darker than a cloud, so this is how the desert inhabitants decided to act. The emperor sharply interrupted the advisors, reminding them that they were the ones who assured that everything was fine and there were no problems with the defense. It was the advisors who insisted on expanding the territory without properly checking everything. Then the emperor reminded them that every word spoken by the advisors would cost them their lives. But as a sign of recognition of their work, the emperor decided to spare their families. Looking at the angry crowd near his palace, the emperor demanded that the advisors take upon themselves all the hatred of the people. Meanwhile, The crowd began to rage even more, demanding the immediate resignation of incompetent officials. Suddenly, a stately man emerged from the palace to the crowd, and the people immediately bowed their heads in respect. This was the man through whose mouth the emperor communicated with the people. The emperor's envoy demanded that the people raise their heads. Then the envoy announced that only today the emperor realized that his eyes had been blind and his ears deaf. The crowd froze in shock, paying attention to every word of the man from the palace. Then the envoy demanded that the criminals be brought, and 3 advisors were dragged to the palace gates. The advisors were supposed to be the eyes and ears of the emperor, but instead they hid the voices of the people's representatives from him. For this, they deserved death. The guards behind immediately swung their swords, and 3 heads rolled along the pavement. The once enraged citizens' crowd froze in horror at such a sight. After a deathly silence, the crowd exploded with cheers, greeting and praising the emperor. Among the crowd was Hiruna, who was closely watching what was happening. It was such manipulations she wanted to learn. After that, Hiruna went down to the dungeon to Moden and Classic, who were guarding the prisoners. Both guards were very surprised by the appearance of Lady Hiruna, and immediately jumped up from their seats. Hiruna wanted to talk to the prisoners, but Classic immediately objected, saying that the Supreme Warrior had strictly ordered not to let Hiruna near the captives. She put the guards in an extremely awkward position, so Moden suggested first getting permission from the Supreme Warrior. Then Hiruna wanted to hear what the guards had managed to learn from the prisoners. But apart from some nonsense about establishing order in chaos, the guards failed to get anything from the prisoners. Nevertheless, the guards promised to inform Hiruna as soon as they found out who they were and what they were plotting. Hiruna nodded affirmatively, but the prisoners' words seemed familiar to her. She had heard them before. Suddenly, she remembered how once after training, Noah, carrying her on his shoulders, promised to teach Hiruna to bring order, even in the greatest chaos. Noah said it in passing, but Hiruna was sure that it definitely happened. Nevertheless, Hiruna was certain that whoever was behind the attack on her, their methods were wrong and they would pay dearly for it. It was deep night outside. Orca was thoughtfully looking at the moon. Suddenly his attention was caught by a falling star, and tears appeared in Orca's eyes. He understood what had happened to Lady Matata. Wiping his tears, he turned to the warriors behind him and announced that the path was open. Spiny vines entwined the portal, creating a kind of labyrinth through which it was harder for the monsters to break through. They were created by Ariel, who settled on one of the vines and watched the procession of monsters emerging from the portal. Suddenly, a man in a hood jumped down onto the vine next to her. He was one of the rangers, and his name was Sebastian. Watching the monsters, Sebastian wondered if they would cope, since the previous information about the monsters was now useless. But Ariel did not share his gloomy thoughts. On the contrary, she was confident that as soon as the data was updated, they would easily be able to destroy the monsters. Of course, deep down, Sebastian also hoped for this, but when he looked at the creatures, he felt as if they had touched something they shouldn't have. Nevertheless, Ariel assured him that everything was under control and there was no need to worry so much, since they did not desire the end of the world. And although Ariel's words sounded convincing, Sebastian still doubted, because these creatures were originally uncontrollable. Meanwhile, on the fortress wall of one of the border castles, a bearded commander named Georg ordered the archers to open fire on the monsters approaching the castle. The archers fired a volley, and the first rank of creatures fell dead to the ground, but the warriors continued to shower the monsters with arrows, giving them no chance to climb the wall. But no matter how many monsters they killed, new monsters kept coming from somewhere. Suddenly, one of the monsters managed to jump onto the fortress wall, and one of the archers screamed in fright. But Georg immediately jumped at the monster and cut off its head. Of course, he understood that as long as the gates were open, these assaults would not end, and if it continued like this, they would all be destroyed. The archers on the walls began to run out of arrows and requested ammunition from the warriors below. Then a boy named Charlie grabbed the quivers with arrows and ran to help. Of course, Charlie was not eager to rush into the very heat and die, but if he did not bring the arrows, everyone would perish. Suddenly, one of the monsters that had broken inside blocked his way. Charlie was paralyzed with horror, but he had to go. He had to deliver the arrows. In despair, Charlie closed his eyes and screamed with all his might, already mentally preparing to say goodbye to life. A second later, Charlie opened his eyes and realized he was alive. The monster was cut in two, and Hiruna was standing behind him with her back turned. Assessing the situation, Hiruna understood that it was already too late, and the monsters had begun climbing over the walls. 5 creatures immediately began attacking her from the wall, but Hiruna used her belt to split the monsters in half. Then she suddenly jumped. She found herself on the fortress wall right between the defenders and the advancing monsters. The soldiers were stunned by Hiruna's sudden appearance and immediately asked her to retreat. A question arose in Georg's mind about what the leadership was thinking sending such a girl as reinforcement. After all, he considered Hiruna a burden who would only add to the headache in case of her death. Hiruna ordered the soldiers to step back, and then with one swing of her belt destroyed all the creatures at once. The soldiers were shocked at how such a fragile person could defeat a whole horde of monsters with one blow. Looking at all the arriving monsters, Hiruna wondered if this was not beyond the bounds of a warning. Without a shadow of a doubt, Hiruna climbed the fortress wall to the general amazement of the castle defenders. Then, jumping off the wall, she began to hover over the monsters gathered below. Using the combat method of yin and yang unity, perfect harmony of heaven and earth, Hiruna created a magical seal under the monsters. A vortex began to form, pulling the beasts inside and tearing them to pieces. After a few seconds, it was all over. The bodies of mutilated monsters lay on the ground. But there were too many creatures. They seemed endless, and if not hurried, there would be even more victims. So Hiruna decided to finish off the monsters with one strike. Of course, she remembered Noah's warning not to show martial arts without a special reason, but Hiruna interpreted his words in her own way. Using the martial art Dance of the Storm, Hiruna created a giant whirlwind that swept away monsters in its path. Georg watched the events spellbound. At first, he was furious that they had sent him a princess from another country as reinforcement, but now Hiruna looked more like a goddess of war than a defenseless princess. Having descended to the ground among the corpses of the monsters she had defeated, Hiruna gave the order to the castle defenders to immediately bring the squad into order, for there were still monsters remaining. Georg immediately began giving instructions to his subordinates, ordering the spearmen to push back the monsters and the archers to take positions and aim. Meanwhile, a new wave of monsters was already approaching the castle walls. Of course, Hiruna was sure she could hold back this wave of monsters too, but if the gates are not closed, it will repeat again and again. Hiruna, preparing for a new battle, prayed that the emperor could close the gates as soon as possible. Suddenly, a giant monster blocked the path of the small detachment led by the emperor. The guards immediately stepped forward, covering their lord, but the emperor was not afraid. He looked at the monster appraisingly, assuming that if they defeated this monster, the portal should close. Then the emperor advised the nearest warrior, whose name was Garen, to go behind the monster and attack as soon as it struck. The monster did not keep them waiting long and attacked. The warriors scattered, and Garen immediately rushed to carry out the emperor's will. He even managed to wound the creature, but the monster was more agile and sent Garen flying with a strike of its tail. Fortunately, the emperor managed to put out his hand and stop Garen's flight. Then the emperor ordered his warriors to step back. They were not masters of strength, so it was difficult for them to deal with the monster. The emperor boldly stepped towards the monster. Although he had gained extra weight recently, he still decided to personally deal with the creature. The warriors retreated as the emperor commanded. Garen's left arm was broken, but he was still ready to fight. The monster swung its huge paw, intending to crush the emperor. The knights shouted in despair for the emperor to run away, but he stubbornly stayed in place, wanting to test the true strength of the monster, and the giant paw thunderously fell to the ground, completely covering the emperor. Suddenly, the monster's eyes widened in surprise. Something prevented the paw from fully touching the ground. It was the emperor himself who raised his hand and stopped the monster's paw without moving from his place. A smile illuminated the emperor's face. Now he understood why Garen lost. Bright light filled the space around, and the emperor took on his true form. With a sharp movement, he shook off the monster's paw, thus throwing it off balance. Then, jumping up, the emperor found himself on the head of the giant creature. Raising his hand above the monster's head, the emperor intended to test if the beast could withstand his blow, and he unleashed all his strength on the monster's head. The strike was so powerful it pierced the creature's head through. The monster staggered and fell dead to the ground. The emperor managed to jump off, taking a more familiar form. The monster's body began to disappear, and in its place the emperor found a bracelet. Taking it in his hands, the Emperor began to study the bracelet with interest, as it was strange, usually crystals dropped from monsters. Once again surveying the battlefield, the Emperor gave the order to retreat. The bracelet discovered by the Emperor rested on a handkerchief in the middle of the table, surrounded by the Empire's mages. No divine power was found in the bracelet. However, like any artifact, it emitted magical energy. Trevor, a mage in red robes, discovered mentions that in ancient times monsters left artifacts, but no such records have been found in recent centuries. This bracelet was personally obtained by the Emperor, so Grimaldo suggested that ancient monsters have reappeared. Then Walter proposed to transfer the bracelet to his magical tower, so that after studying it, they could accurately say what this item is. The era called the Era of Power and Magic eventually ended. There were many different opinions, but in the end, everyone agreed on one thing. Too much power and magic led to people starting to fight among themselves and destroying each other. But Walter was still plagued by doubts. If everything was like that, then the strongest should have survived. But Grimaldo explained that this era was destroyed by water, and Trevor immediately added that this is written in the Holy Book, and there is a similar record in the Temple of the Sun. Then Sylvia, who was attentively listening to her colleagues, spoke up, stating that there are similar records in her temple as well. This only made Walter laugh. Although they worship different gods, the content of the records is still the same. And he had mocked the idea that wizards seeking the truth of the world should study theology. Apparently, he also needs to learn a little. Suddenly, Walter became interested in what happened after the end of the ancient era. Trevor immediately answered his question, saying that a new species perished because of water. After all, ice is also water. It was said to be so cold that even the sun could not cope with it. Then most species perished, and the surviving humans once again began to rule this world. Here Walter pondered. The gods were indeed terrifying beings, but surely there were those who kept the faith. On the snowy plain, monsters continued to fiercely advance on the people. Sebastian shot arrow after arrow, not letting the creatures get closer. The warriors immediately covered Ariel, who had descended from the hill with their shields. Their task was to prevent the monsters from reaching her. Focusing, Ariel began to cast spells, and then, directing her staff, unleashed an electric charge on the monsters. From the nearby mountain slope, the sky sage named Thea was watching everything that was happening. Pointing her staff at the sky, Thea used disappearance magic on the portal through which the monsters were coming out. At that very moment, the portal was engulfed in green flames, and it vanished, leaving only a small crater on the frozen ground. The sky sage immediately jumped down from the cliff and landed next to Ariel, as there was no longer any need to hide his presence. Ariel bowed her head to greet Thea, but he was not as friendly. He was more interested in what Ariel was thinking about it all, but Ariel simply followed her path, despite the fact that at the end of this path was only destruction. She still hoped that there would be no more wars in the world. The Sage of the Heavens shared her hopes, although more blood would be shed in this war than in those they tried to stop. Suddenly, Yar interrupted the conversation, stating that small sacrifices are necessary for a better world. These words greatly surprised Taya. If Yar considers this an excessive sacrifice, then let those who believe in this cause deal with it. Yar acted according to his beliefs. Among them, there was no one who was not ready for this. Therefore, he advised Taya not to neglect their convictions. But the Sage of the Heavens considered their beliefs mistaken, for many people died knowing nothing and having no chance to resist. These words enraged Yar. Although Taya had revealed the secrets of the heavens, he was completely ignorant in earthly matters. Drawing a dagger from behind his back, Yar advised the Sage of the Heavens not to appear here alone, for from now on their paths diverged. To which Taya replied that these were just words, and Yar relied excessively on another's strength. Yar could no longer endure such an insult and immediately rushed at the Sage of the Heavens. Ariel tried to stop him, but the sword plunged into the ground before Yar made him slow down. Like Yar, the Sage of the Heavens also had those who shared his faith, and he also relied on their strength. At that moment, a black-haired man of rather formidable appearance hovered on the hilt of the sword. His name was Roof. Shifting his gaze to the Sage of the Heavens, Roof greeted him and asked if he was angry, but Taya only remained silent in response. Behind the Sage of the Heavens also appeared Vincent. He was extremely displeased that they were meddling in matters not their own. Yar's eyes widened in surprise. The warriors behind were also shocked. Only Ariel remained calm. Finally, he began to come to himself. His gaze immediately stopped on Roof. He instantly recognized him as a master of strength. In Yara's head, an attack plan was slowly taking shape. He and Yor would fight Roof, while his comrades would deal with Ariel and the others. But Taya had already figured out his plan and decided to provoke Yar by calling him a blind fool. The provocation succeeded. Blinded by rage, Yar immediately rushed at Tay, but Roof blocked his way. But Yar was not going to stop and delivered 2 diagonal strikes aiming to hit Roof. Suddenly, Sebastian shouted for Yar to turn around. Turning his head, Yar noticed that Roof was on the flank and had already raised his palm to strike his unprotected neck. Yar had already come to terms with his end. Only one question troubled him. When did Roof manage to come in from the flank, since he hadn't noticed at all how he moved? Suddenly, Yara's twin brother, Yor, went on the attack. With a wild scream, he tried to attack, so Rufu had to retreat. Of course, Roof understood that he was stronger than both brothers, but he still praised Yor for his zeal. Then Ariel ordered the brothers to stop immediately, but the twins were so focused on the duel that they simply did not hear her. Then Ariel, using paralysis magic on the twins, stepped forward and greeted Vincent and Roof. Vincent, looking sadly at Ariel, asked if she had already finished analyzing their strength. To which Ariel calmly replied that did she really need to analyze the two of them again, since she had already seen a lot before. Afterwards, Ariel stated that they were going to leave, as there were still gates they needed to close. But Thea still could not understand. Did Ariel and her comrades make it so that the gates could not be closed in the usual way, and now they go and close them? Ariel's main goal was to regulate the number of portals, as she did not want the whole world to perish. After saying goodbye, Ariel and the twins departed, wishing Thea and his comrades good luck. Ariel and her companions, riding horses, quickly crossed the snowy plain. Suddenly, Yar, who was riding nearby, decided to ask why they had retreated. Wasn't their strength enough? Then Ariel reminded him that everyone agreed, she thinks, and the rest execute. Of course, Yar did not intend to question Ariel's authority. He was simply curious. Ariel believed that Taya was not worth the bloodshed of any of the twins. Moreover, he was one of the means that would help her keep the world from chaos if everything suddenly got out of control. At this point, Yor decided to intervene in the conversation, reminding that it was precisely because of this that one of the operations had failed. But Ariel knew that it was impossible to always achieve success. Don't the instincts of the twins tell them whom they can attack and whom they cannot? Yor was very surprised. Could it be that the swordsman who accompanied Taya was so strong? Then Ariel asked him if he had heard anything about the personal guard of Rosini. Yor's eyes widened in horror. Had they really encountered such a formidable opponent? Ariel only nodded affirmatively. Those who could fight Roof could be counted on the fingers of one hand. And although the twins were masters of power, people possessing the most powerful physical strength in the world. But the opponent was too strong. They were monsters beyond the ordinary. But Yar was not going to fall behind them easily. This was their strong point with his brother. Soon, Punin was supposed to erect a mysterious temple, so Ariel advised the twins to capture it, and then they too could become unusual monsters. Vincent carefully studied the crater left by the portal. He could feel that the properties of mana had changed. Taya nodded affirmatively. Recently, it had become impossible to close the gates by removing the cores. Then Vincent wondered, was this the work of Ariel? But Taya dispelled his doubts. The changes were caused by Punin himself, and she only accelerated the process. And although these things were completely unpredictable, chaos touched Punin first, so he surely knows everything about everything. Fortunately for Taya, he also had a person well-versed in this, so they would soon find out why and how monsters appear and disappear. But Vincent was extremely dissatisfied that Mirik was still locked in the Tower of Arrogance. Then Taya reminded him that the leader must be in chaos, and Mirik must be in the tower. Nevertheless, there was no need to worry. She had already begun to move. Meanwhile, Julian, being in the shadow space, was singing a new song. The song truly made Julian stronger, for the shadow space began to crack, and then it all collapsed. Julian was in the middle of the desert, a satisfied smile playing on his face, for he had not even thought he could become stronger. Of course, Julian perfectly understood that arrogance could only be allowed after fighting a master 10 times and winning at least once. But even with such strength, there was a chance to encounter beings that Julian could not even look at. Suddenly, Julian felt that someone behind was watching him intently. In the middle of the oasis, in a comfortable gazebo, Julian, Lakri, and Mirik, who was the strange figure watching the leader in the desert, were having a casual conversation over a cup of tea. Lakri was a little surprised that Mirik came without warning, since she could have just called and Lakri would have come herself. But Mirik did not want to bother Lakri, since there was already a lot to do in the desert. Meanwhile, Julian studied Mirik with his gaze, since he did not feel anyone's presence, and no one except the master could deceive his perception. As if reading his thoughts, Mirik said that although they were meeting for the first time, she had already seen the god of war several times. Mirik also apologized for spying on Julian's training in the desert. When Julian became the god of war, Mirik gained confidence that the bloodshed in the desert would soon end. But in Julian's opinion, even more blood was being shed now than before. He wondered how much Mirik knew and from where. And again, as if reading Julian's thoughts, Mirik explained that she had met Noah and had heard a lot about Julian from him. Julian sighed heavily. He had heard so many different things from his teacher, from the priestess, and from many others, but he still did not understand most of it. He understood only one thing. As soon as the seal is broken, a new species will destroy humanity. Also, Julian came to the conclusion that chaos is trying to break the seal and unite humanity, while the magical tower was trying to prevent this. But Mirik gave evasive answers to both questions, further puzzling Julian. Of course, she understood the feelings of the god of war. If everything is divided strictly into black and white, doubts may remain. No one wanted total extermination, they just had different methods. You can be enemies, but sometimes it is necessary to unite. Julian still did not quite understand what Mirik was hinting at, so she tried to explain. The beginning of the transformation of monster species, unclosing gates, and even the crossing of ancient legacies, all caused by chaos. But it is chaos that restrains all this, albeit partially. Finally, Julian realized everything, and since they caused all these changes, it means they are enemies. But Mirik asked him not to take everything so harshly, because in some cases it might be necessary to unite with them. Nevertheless, Julian was adamant. He only wanted to protect his people in the desert, and anyone who interfered could become his enemy. In response, Mirik only smiled. Since Julian had decided so, so be it, for the chosen one must defend his beliefs. Rising from the table, Mirik said goodbye, asking Lakri to visit the tower briefly one last time. They had studied something that could help the desert. Then Mirik asked Julian not to show hostility, because the unions and other people would start to act. In turn, Julian promised that they would not close their eyes and ears to those who could help them. Such an answer fully satisfied Mirik. She also invited Julian to the tower, then bowing her head, struck with her staff and disappeared. On the shore of the Shadow Sea, Julian was telling Shubion about his meeting with Mirik. The more Shubion learned, the more he believed that the tower, like chaos, was simply mad. They, the soldiers, just had to do their duty. Orca was hurrying to join them. The meeting was already over, although it rather resembled an information transfer. Orca still did not understand why Julian himself did not participate in the meeting, because even if he summarized and passed on the information, it was still more useful to hear it himself. But Julian thought differently. Until everything calmed down, it was better for him to focus on what he did best. For everything else, he had loyal comrades. Moreover, Orca, like no one else, understood how difficult it was to cope with the seal. That is why Orca was the commander-in-chief, and Julian, as a great warrior, became his sword. Here, Julian decided to ask what, in Orca's opinion, should be their main priority. Then Orca pondered, if it was for the desert, then the great warrior Luna was right and the hero's path was above all. If it concerned the seal, then they should go to the oasis of Yusa. When the oasis was mentioned, Shubion interrupted the conversation, asking if the great warrior Million was not watching over the Yusa oasis. Then Orca told about the appearance of a new enemy, a creature known as the King of the Dead, also called a lich or necromancer on the continent. Currently, they maintain control, but over time, the scale of the problem will increase, and eventually everything may get out of control. Moreover, Yusa is an important supply route connecting the eastern and western deserts, as well as a trade route leading to other countries. Therefore, they must maintain full control over it and better solve this problem first, using all available resources. Julian was proud of how his brother had grown. If the commander-in-chief's finger points to the Yusa oasis, then the sword must follow him. Orca also wanted to tell Julian about other problems, but he interrupted him by placing a hand on his shoulder. In Julian's opinion, Orca should not worry so much. He only needed to direct the sword, and he himself would take care of everything else. Orca was a little confused because he was supposed to receive information from the Magic Tower and the Shur tribe from Julian. But Orca immediately remembered his brother's words. He could not allow Julian to lose focus because of his words. Therefore, Orca nodded affirmatively. He would do everything to fully utilize Julian's power. It was late at night, and Luna was still going through the reports. Luna was very tired, and the only thing he wanted right now was to get a good sleep. Suddenly, the magical sphere shone. Luna was very surprised who would want to communicate at such a late hour. Taking magical sand from the drawer on the table, Luna threw it into the blinking sphere, and immediately an image of Hiruna appeared in the sphere. Luna greeted the young lady. But what made Hiruna contact him at such a late hour, since her dawn was just beginning? Hiruna urgently needed to report that monsters inside the gates had started leaving behind ancient artifacts and magical stones, and the atmosphere inside the gates had also begun to change. The report shocked Luna. Nevertheless, he continued to listen to Hiruna attentively. According to her, the Empire was still conducting investigations, but these were definitely artifacts. So Hiruna believed that her tribe should also check old documents. That same night at the meeting, Luna conveyed Hiruna's words, but still believed that the problem that needed to be solved most urgently was the Yusa oasis. Because if river transport became unavailable, then movement would become too difficult. Julian decided to make this task a priority, but all the warriors were currently overloaded. That is why Julian decided that Shubian would not participate in this expedition. After all, if more than half of the Red Storm is absent, they will not be able to react quickly in case of an unforeseen situation on the continent. However, if Shubian remains, the Supreme Warrior of the Moon will have more freedom of action, so he has no choice but to keep the most experienced vanguard commander. Of course, Shubian was not very pleased with the leader's decision, but nevertheless obeyed the order. The current situation was different from yesterday's, and tomorrow it could change again, which is why anxiety gripped everyone like a sandstorm. But Julian intended to prove that it was nothing more than an illusion, and everything was under their full control. The sun was at its zenith when Chanatu decided to refresh himself after training and poured a full bucket of water over himself. Turning around, he noticed the approaching Garian. The latter also noticed that the Supreme Priest was especially strict with the fourth-generation students, pointing to the bruises on Chanatu's body, to which Chanatu smiled in response. He believed that his generation was time to take the initiative. But Garian held the opposite opinion. They were not ready yet. None of his generation of the storm had retired yet. Nevertheless, Chanatu was not going to give up so easily. Although Garion was not going to retire yet, most of his senior comrades were leaving to become commanders of combat units. A smile of disappointment passed over Garion's face, but such is the duty of senior warriors to lead the youth. Garion was confident that Chanatu would succeed. Nevertheless, he must always remain vigilant, for the leader and other great warriors place great hopes on him. In response, he nodded affirmatively to the Kanate and was about to continue training. Meanwhile, under the full moon in the endless desert, Julian led his troops to the goal. The Lord of the Desert made his choice, and he was determined to fulfill his plan. It was about a campaign that would break the seal of the Eastern Desert. The troops under Julian's command emerged from the portal on the shores of the Shadow Sea. Julian was resolutely determined to end the endless bloodshed and bravely stepped into the passage opened by Matata. This road leads into the unknown, but one thing is certain: countless monsters await them on the other side. and their king possessing overwhelming power, yet all were united in heart, believing they could stop the monsters and protect those dear to them. Julian was no longer going to tolerate this on his land, and tirelessly led his army forward. Finally, something appeared on the horizon. It was a horde of monsters rapidly approaching the people. But Julian did not intend to slow down. He was already tired of these small creatures, and ordering the warriors not to slow down, rushed forward. A thought flashed through Julian's mind that if worthy opponents had appeared from the very beginning, it would have been much easier. Bursting into the ranks of monsters, the god of war began to sow death and chaos everywhere his blade reached. Monsters fell dead one after another, which only further inflamed Julian, for by destroying the creatures, he would prove the value of his existence. The desert warriors stopped, mesmerized, watching as their leader methodically destroyed the monsters. The orc even opened his mouth in surprise. How had they lived all this time? Hambaba, who was watching this, pondered, for he believed that human warriors, no matter what they were like, would still be weaker than orcs. But now, calling Julian a human was unthinkable. There were no hesitations typical of a human in him. Finally, Julian dealt with the first wave of monsters, but on the horizon was already the next wave. The creatures had no end. But Julian was not going to retreat. On the contrary, he urged the monsters to attack more actively, for he intended to destroy them all. Time and again, using the whirlwind of destruction, Julian swept away the second wave of creatures as well. At last, the small monsters were finished, but suddenly a black fog from the corpses of the monsters began to gather at one point. The horse nervously shifted in place, and Julian, sensing something was wrong, gripped his sword more firmly, and he was not mistaken. Before him appeared a colossal-sized monster. But Julian only smiled. Finally, a worthy opponent appeared. Orca nervously swallowed. He felt a powerful mana emanating from the monster. He had encountered such monsters before. Of course, Orca tried to leave his brother, but Julian did not listen to him and rushed forward. Such behavior of the brother was incomprehensible to Orca. Why recklessly rush at a monster wielding magic? Pushing off the horse's back, Julian began to rise in leaps from the air towards the monster, as if climbing a ladder. Suddenly, the creature tried to attack, swinging its huge hand. But Julian, with one swing of his blade, cut off the monster's paw. Without slowing down, Julian found himself at the monster's snout. Here, the monsters attacked again, opening their mouths and beginning to concentrate mana. This caused only a smirk on Julian's face. Is this really all the monster is capable of? Raising the blade above his head, Julian with one strike cut the giant monster in half, not allowing it to finish the attack. Everyone was shocked. Such a number of monsters, and a giant monster at that, and Julian dealt with them all alone. It was unimaginable. After recovering a little from the shock, the warriors immediately hurried to their leader to quickly make sure he was all right. But Julian was more concerned about the black fog emanating from the monsters and the glowing clusters inside it.